Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, welcome to FIIA Day and welcome to celebrate our 65th anniversary. My name is Samu Paukkunen and I'm the Deputy Director of Finnish Institute of International Affairs. It is my pleasure to open our discussions and start with a few remarks of my own. Yesterday, when I heard that Dr. Hiski Haukkala, our director, was still feeling poor, I started frantically to search for quotes, any quotes to begin with, something that would make me seem smarter than I actually am. So I did what I always do in the time of crisis: duck and cover and hide in my room. After I went and saw my colleague, Dr. Matti Pesu, because he knows everything. But to my bafflement, even he didn't have a quote ready. But he asked me just to come up with the quote of my own, saying that only one person in the audience would know that. Of course, I didn't follow what he suggested, but instead I went through President Paasikivi's speeches from 1949 to 56 and found the following analysis on his New Year speech in 1956. And I quote, "In the past year, attempts to resolve international relations have shown that the perceptions of the power groups on open problems differ so much that it has not been possible to achieve decisive results. In addition to the problems in Europe, there are also areas of disagreement in Asia where enormous changes are taking place." The reason I chose this quote is because it proves three things. World has still not changed. Tensions keep on piling. And we still need to better understand these powers and relations that dictate our surroundings. And the reason I chose Paasikivi is because the Paasikivi Society, formed a couple of years after his death, was responsible for the establishment of FIIA alongside with Ulkopolitiikka magazine and the Foundation for Foreign Policy Research. And ever since, from 1961 onwards, FIIA has existed as the leading foreign policy research institute in Finland. First funded by the Ministry of Education and Culture when we were supported by the foundation. And from 2006 onwards as an independent research institute affiliated with the Parliament of Finland. For 65 years, FIIA has conducted research, engaged in public debate, and where needed, supported the political decision-making. We have published thousands of pages of research. We have arranged thousands of events. And you've seen our researchers in national media thousands of times. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had our ups and downs, our successes and our failures. Foreign policy is a delicate topic and it arouses much debate. While we base our work on research, there is always the risk that someone will interpret our analysis as being at odds with their own thinking. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we were trying to explain the events and consequences for Finland. When Finland started its path towards NATO, it was our researchers describing the steps and the risks. And whenever there is a major upheaval, we try to understand its consequences and effects and do it in a way that seeks to explain how it will affect us. And we still feel young. And there is a lot more that we can actually do. By many metrics, we are already the leading Nordic Research Institute think tank in our field. Our research is world-class, and we appear in the leading journals, just like Foreign Affairs and International Affairs, not to mention even the appearances in global media. All this has been possible because of our dedicated people. This is why I would want to thank each and every FIIAns throughout the generations. And I know that in this room we have several generations of FIIAns present. Without your expertise, your devotion, your enthusiasm, we would not be here today. And I would also like to thank the Parliament of Finland for understanding the value of foreign policy research and for supporting us. Ladies and gentlemen, as this is a year of celebration, we wanted to take FIIA also out of Helsinki and bring our research to the countryside. FIIA has opened a call for application in which it welcomes invitation to various public events and forums where foreign policy discussions is appropriate. Researchers will visit different parts of the country to discuss, among other things, Finnish foreign and security policy, Russia, European Union, and climate and technology policies. But today we are here. Today's event is a celebration of research. We will be discussing about Russia and our options and possibilities. We are happy to provide such an overview of analysis by some of the leading experts in the world. While some had to cancel their participation, we still have a formidable collection of researchers, both from FIIA and her sister organizations. Without further ado, I would like to welcome you all to our celebration and in our discussions. We start today with the direction of Russia and then take a look what Russia's full spectrum influence activities in Finland in the 2000s looked like. After that, we ask ourselves the question, how will we cope with Russia? Or can we? And after the panels, you are all welcome to join us and have drinks. Let's get ready to rumble. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Samu, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jussi Niemeläinen. I'm editorial writer with Helsingin Sanomat, one of the great cardinals who write those nameless texts for the newspaper. And I'm a former Moscow correspondent for the paper as well. And today our topic is, where is Russia headed? And I'm very happy to start by introducing our stellar panel here. We have Laura Solanko, who's a special senior advisor at BOFIT, and BOFIT is Bank of Finland's Institute for Emerging Economies, right? Right. Welcome.
Thank you.
We have Margarita Zavadskaya from FIIA, senior research fellow, who's specialist on domestic policy in Russia, but especially mass protest and public opinion rights. Welcome. And we have Jussi Lassila, who's probably very well known to everybody from our studio also, but he's obviously from FIIA. And he's also a specialist on Russian domestic policies, identity politics in particular. So, welcome. And our topic is famously difficult. Where is Russia headed? That's a topic that people have made that's complicated and keeps changing all the time. But I think we could start, and we have an hour and 15 minutes, and we have an hour for the panel, and then we have 15 minutes for questions if you have any from audience here at Biorex. But if we start, Laura, what is the most interesting and important development in Russia at the moment that you are paying attention to, and you think everybody else should as well?
Oh, thank you. That's a good question. On, say, at least for me personally, what sort of what I see happening in the Russian economy right now is that there are increasingly signs of stress, decelerating or outright stalling economic growth, and the continued disbalance between monetary and economic policy making is causing increasingly troubles for the macroeconomic management of the country, and solving these challenges is made more difficult by Western sanctions that keep Russia out of global financial markets. Financing the budget deficit is actually the key sort of example of these troubles ahead. And this sort of already a few weeks ago, the government started discussing cutting expenditure simply because it was evident that revenue targets will not be met. And managing these sorts of cuts is quite often a tedious task and prone to mistakes. This sad sort of no economic growth, hard times, budget cuts, does not mean that the country would be on a brink of a systemic crisis. We in Finland have sort of lived for several years in a row when economy is not really growing and real incomes of the population are not really growing, and that does not necessarily in itself lead to a revolution or a change of the regime, and especially so authoritarian regimes tend not to collapse due to economic hardships only. So that's why I also, on the other hand, would like to be a bit cautious on whether it's fruitful for us to wait for an economic collapse either. Thank you.
So you're the pessimist in the panel.
Well, I'm an economist. Yes. Apologies.
Yeah. Margarita, what do you think? What do you see? What you're looking at right now as the key thing?
Okay, so it's a big pleasure to be here. So I will probably start with a general statement. I'm trying to play a bit of an optimist here. As a political scientist, Russian regime is actually one of the notoriously boring examples. Not boring for us being here in Finland and in Europe in general, not to say in Ukraine, but it's a personalist dictatorship. What does it mean for us and for policymakers? It means that it's very poorly governed. It's deeply corrupt and it's unpredictable. The degree of internal uncertainty among the elites, economic elites, business, is a constant shadow that basically is hanging over this whole architecture. So the paradox is, it looks extremely consolidated and strong, but at the same time, it's a monster on very weak legs.
So it's hard and hollow at the same time, in a way.
Exactly. So it might sound paradoxical, but such regimes, if we look at some remotely similar dictatorial regimes in the past. I know probably history is not the best teacher in some cases, and some things just happen for the first time, but such regimes collapse very fast and quite unpredictably. So this is something that probably my overall message is to be prepared for all sorts of contingencies, although I mostly share Laura's vision on the economic impact on the regime stability. Yes, dictatorial regimes can survive, even having extremely poor, corrupt economies. Look at the poorest regimes in other parts of the world. So in this sense, Russia is actually in a better position, having nuclear weapons and having the military sector and other strengths, including, for instance, IT sector, which is still underdeveloped compared to its American, European counterparts, but it's still sufficiently capable to inflict harm to its neighbors.
And Jussi.
Okay, I could, simply stop here and just definitely agree with what Margarita pointed out, but to point out where I'm particularly interested is that it is still this basic model of Putin's rule which actually still remained during the full-scale invasion, but it is, maybe already come, but it's certainly becoming very seriously distorted. And this basic model is that what we do know, and several times pointed out, and actually which is the basis for I would say, the Putin's kind of consolidation, and is a very strong grip in Russia, in Russian society and over the elites, but especially concerning the state-society relations. It is the idea that the regime provides some sort of a sense of stability, which is still there, prosperity, and this kind of future horizon. And definitely Putin has succeeded in that if we take a look at over the 25 years. But the other side of the coin is that for that, giving that prosperity to the people or the sense of being for the people, it's that people keep their hands off the politics, vote for the right candidates, right party, and this works. But when the regime is becoming more ideological, there is more and more aggressive and crazy geopolitical visions, and it requires mobilization, this becomes extremely problematic. And here we can also, lots of discussion about that whether Russians are interested in political alternatives. We can say that, to put it bluntly, Russians are not interested in opposition politics or suggestions, but they are not interested in regime suggestions as well. They want to live in peace and to get rid of from politics. And now what we're seeing is that while the regime is pushing more and more all kinds of crazy militarization and patriotism, people are more and more reluctant. And we just take a look of any survey that the war fatigue is growing. The latest, what Levada also, that the support for peace, which is the start of the peace negotiation, is the highest since the full scale of the invasion. And the support for continuation of the war is the lowest. And this is where Putin still wants to follow. He wants still to achieve something. So I would say that this, and of course the solution for this problem is that where we are not aiming to mobilize or going to the full-scale mobilizing, they have developed this kind of a mercenary model, which is also becoming a great problem. We are daily basis reading the growing difficulties of getting enough recruits for the front. As an economic consequence, there's a huge inflation for the remunerations. They need to pay more and more and more, and there's a crazy competition where all those wishing to volunteer travel to those regions where they are paying the highest remunerations. So it's completely kind of a crazy model. On the other hand, what is particularly interesting, and I could say here, is that in Moscow, where they try to remain outside of this war and to keep it normalcy, the support for the war is the highest, and they are the people who are not going to fight. So there is this kind of sofa patriotism, or this kind of an abstract appreciation of this militarization, but they are not going for fighting. So this shows that this Putin's model is still working. The nerve centers are kept out of the war, and Moscow in particular, and those poorer regions are fully exploited. But now obviously some limits are becoming the head because there are no more troops.
Because you kind of describe the essence of Putinism, that the Putin's Russia is both authoritarian and populist at the same time. And that's been possible thanks to the money they've had. So do you think, are we going to see more and more repressive Russia now that there is less money available to buy people's support? That people it's fatigue, they might be complaining, they might not go out to the streets because they don't have the risks. But do you think that it's going to get more repressive, Margaret?
Yes, absolutely. So the last year actually proved to be the most horrible in terms of repression, not only towards opposition movements and civil society, that it's still, to some extent, to the extent we can know it, is alive, being fragmented and invisible to us and to the Western journalists especially. But at the same time, it also sort of has a friendly fire in a sense. Yeah. Also, regime loyalists fall into the same trap. There are also cases of imprisonment, and we paradoxically, some people also refer to them as political prisoners, although they are dissidents from the opposite side. To give you an example of Strelkov, although it's not the last year, it happened much earlier. But such cases are becoming more and more prominent. It means that anything that is vaguely political, politics means agency. Agency means autonomy. Autonomy means something that Kremlin doesn't control. So it's intrinsically a danger. If you watch, if you kind of keep track on the news, what's going on right now in Russia, it's obviously this Telegram ban. And the hunt for Durov, Pavel Durov, and basically whatever he's going to do, whether he's going to give up to the Kremlin and give all the passwords and all the keys to people's messengers. So it's unlikely to happen. But what is really important here is that Telegram is so important for anything that is vaguely political, again, on both sides of the regime, so that it actually poses an imminent danger, or is seen as an imminent danger to the regime. So this is why, that's probably the easiest explanation of whatever is happening right now. So Russia is not going to actually hit the Chinese level of censorship. It's not going to happen. It doesn't have this capacity. But at the same time, it's kind of...
Is there will, but there's no...
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes, because one of the watchdogs in Russia is Roskomnadzor, is basically should be treated as... it's a quasi-military agency. It's not something that is deal with something very digital, no. It's actually something that is fighting on the domestic front inside Russia. And it fights anything that Kremlin doesn't think it controls. So, and of course, if we look at just to give you some statistics, last year, the number of high treason cases peaked. Yeah. So the first department, Первый отдел, reported extremely high numbers of people accused on this article. So it's the highest so far in the post-Soviet history.
That's an important point, because it's quite easy to forget here that the kind of a pro-regime activism is frowned upon by the Kremlin if it's freelance. That they don't. If you're gonna go support Putin on Red Square, you end up in Autozak, in the police bus as well.
If it's not sanctioned by the Kremlin, yes.
Yeah. But do you see, what do you think? This year is also election year in Russia, and this might sound silly because we all know that for 30 years they haven't had any free or fair elections, but the regime acts as if they were real elections. So do you think that is this year still kind of a lull for that it's going to get much worse after the certain level of support has been acquired at the Duma elections, that they are keeping some of the repressions and other things, or even some of the cuts?
Well, I think they are, I definitely agree. I think that over the last years the Kremlin has become more serious and kind of more prepared, even in a very, well before year they started to prepare for these coming Duma elections. And maybe this have a little bit changed than previously, maybe when there was a more competition, and maybe also the Kremlin had a more genuine mandate, then there was not so and they were kind of rushing in and more this kind of an ad hoc solutions. Now it seems to be that they are well prepared, and that actually indicates that they sense the risks what are there. But there are the big questions is that one basic model of guaranteeing the right result is the so-called corporate voting, which means that all the state enterprises, factories, companies, all the instances which are under the state, which is, by the way, increasing the role of the state because it's a way of also making the people economically dependent. And that actually parts of that social contract that, if the state provides something, I give it back by voting the right candidate. So there is no need for explicit rigging or falsification.
Yep.
But now in the economic situation, it might become problematic because we need to remember that Russia is a huge country. There's a huge differences between different regions. In some regions, they might mobilize very effectively and pressure the people and workers to vote correctly, but not in some other regions. So there's a problem. And indication of what Margarita mentioned about this telegram, there is a funny detail that we have also read all the time, the closure of the mobile internet and these connections and cuts.
It's one of the main news this week.
Yeah, and we never know what, well, okay, there's obviously this sort of a security measure against Ukrainian strikes, but come on, it's also about suppressing the, also one solution that if they don't find the subtle mechanism of closing this dangerous material in Telegram, the easiest way is simply to cut the whole internet. And which also has reports that the plans of expanding the electronic voting, which is these new forms of digital authoritarianism, that when you have an electronic voting, it's a very easy way of provide correct results without a trace.
The paper voting, you have the whole...
Exactly. But now they have to give up because there is no such a reliability because there's no internet. So this is a typical that, for example, this sort of a hard line is pushing in the one direction, but maybe some others in the presidential administration would like to have a more softer means. But this is a quite common.
And just a reminder that the elections don't really matter, but they just matter in the heads of the Kremlin. Laura, is the economy, it's pretty state-orientated now, Laura, yeah.
Well, it's certainly the role of the state is certainly has increased. I mean, that's what happens whenever a country is at war. but on top of that, of course, actually many of the things Margarita just described, and in connection of having more repression and also intra-elite fighting, I think the friendly fire was actually a nice word for that as well. We're witnessing increasing asset redistribution in Russia. And that's something not only that the state would grab private firms, but sort of private actors use the state to sort of change the owner in dubious ways. And that is something that's it's not only creating sort of new business elites and new business interests, but it's also eroding the very base of a market economy, since it's eroding the institution of property rights. And there's, I think, at least I guess all of us here in the panel would agree that the security of property rights in Russia is now weaker than it was before the full-scale invasion.
Yeah, there was certain vagueness before.
Yes, well, sure. But I mean, that's the likelihood that someone will come knocking on your door and telling that actually the real owner is just behind my back has increased. And that's one of the features that will drag Russia's economy going forward. I mean, even if one day the fighting ends, if one day something in the regime changes, these structural changes will have a very long-lasting effect on how Russia might ever recover.
Yeah. Did you have, Margarita, something?
Yeah, just to basically sort of like interplay like this dramatic political economy of Russian regime here. We know the public sector employees is the largest constituency, and basically the war is, from the economic point of view, is also kind of redistributive enterprise in a sense. Sounds very cynical, but it does have its winners and losers. So in this sense, it means that actually the regime since 2022 created additional new constituencies that benefit from whatever is going on right now.
Yeah.
But at the same time, having undermined the very foundation of market economy, so it basically sold its own future and any perspective for the economic growth. And it creates this kind of, short-term gains versus long-term problems for this regime, whoever is going to be in power. So, and the longer the war lasts, so the harder the situation is going to become, because these newly emerging constituencies going to demand what it wants and what it expected the regime to deliver.
Does it also make it harder and harder to end the war? That is Russian leadership kind of needing this war? Or any war going on?
Well, I think this is a puzzling thing because if we take a look at as a Russian society as a whole, I would say that this support for ending the war is enormous. It's not only among the population, but I think the quite a big part of the economic elites and the bureaucracy is quietly hoping the end of that. Unfortunately, the king is thinking differently, and the system is built that everything is trying to please the king. If we take a look at all those policy initiatives and plans, especially from the presidential administration, it's quite easy to read that who's the main audience for that. It's Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're trying to balance that how to not to follow exactly the Putin's rules. But this is a dilemma, and especially it's a kind of puzzling because we do know that how propaganda machinery can make anything as a victory. And I don't see any. I don't follow the argument and that the ending the war would cause the major backlash. Well, among the figures like Girkin and some military enthusiasts, they are problematic figures, but not for Putin's rule. I think that we need to go to the time after Putin, and then if it happens in 20 years, then there is this enormous segment of frustrated veterans, for instance. But under the Putin system, I don't see any risk for ending the war for Putin. So that would be extremely beneficial in any kind of rational thinking. But he is not going to do that.
What kind of peace would Russians like to have? I mean, it's still a very vague term. Is it a victory, or what kind of end result of the war people would be satisfied with? Margarita, have you found it in your studies?
So €1 million question, because we need to ask, first of all, since Russia is dictatorial, personalist regimes, what does Putin want? And he constantly, and he's in a circle, reminded, talk about so-called goals of the special military operation, euphemisms they use to call the war. But actually, the real truth is that there are no KPIs here. They are not stated. The thing is that the right question, in my view, is as much as Russia can grab. So they will never. There is no end game here. There is no plan, like a Gosplan back in the Soviet Union. Okay, as soon as we reach this, we're happy. No, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
As much as they can have, so they will proceed. So it's a question of capacity and political will, as Jussi mentioned. So far, but what does it mean for people? So when it comes to authoritarian regimes, Russian citizens understand that it's not the safest place in the world for them, right, to do certain things. So what's the most rational strategy? To be very risk-averse, to keep it low. So what do they see? They just watch for the elite cues. Whatever elites are saying, from the television, from the Telegram channels that is probably not going to be accessible for the majority of them, etc., etc. So they're looking for cues. What is the safest way to survive and navigate the situation? I'm talking about the majority, not about smaller politicized groups on both sides of the political spectrum. So here comes the question. So what Russians would like? Actually, we don't know because they don't know themselves. Because the regime actually strategically never set and never actually spelled it out loud. What exactly is the end game here?
Yeah, to put it bluntly, that the Russians do not have an opinion on high politics. They say what they accept, maybe more socially accepted, and this is where is this kind of manipulative power from the regime.
That's also that it's easy to say that it would be better if there was no war. That's also a safe thing to say. Laura, did you have something to add?
No, I think that I fully do agree that probably on average Russians would not have an opinion. Because even if they had, would that matter? I think that's the key. But actually, I would like to compliment on what you said about the end of the war from economic point of view. That would certainly be a good strategy. But I'm still slightly perplexed when sometimes we're discussing whether Russia would economically suffer if they ended the war. I don't even really follow the logic on how that would happen. Ending the war would certainly mean less pressure on public expenditure, less need to pay for increased bonuses to everyone recruited and returning back. And besides, ending the war does not necessarily mean that Russia would decide to cut expenses of the military industrial sector. They probably would still feel the need to refill the stocks, prepare for the next aggression or whatever, but it would certainly sort of free up resources, and simply sort of looking at an abstract economic model, Russia's economic well-being would be increased simply by sort of having this level of public expenditure, but shifting part of the expenditure from military to issues like healthcare and education. So that sort of that is a policy choice that the current regime has decided to do, that shift resources to one sectors, and simply reshuffling would sort of be beneficial for the economy. But I don't think that's part of the calculus at all.
And even if it's good for GDP, everything they break, it's meant to be destroyed, the stuff they produce.
Wars, I mean, when the costs of the war is not fought on Russian soil. The costs, direct costs of war are not falling on Russia. And then therefore sort of all the increases in both material and personal expense are consumed within Russia, and that mechanically increases Russia's GDP. And Russian Rosstat, the statistical agency, follows the OECD manuals on how to sort of report issues like production of arms systems and military vehicles in GDP statistics. Those are investments.
Yeah. How much do you trust?
And that increases the GDP, even if those are destroyed in 2 weeks.
Yeah. How much you trust Rosstat at the moment? This is
but that, of course, that's an excellent question that needs to be asked. Broadly, I do trust that Rosstat figures broadly do give a correct picture of the changes. It's more what has certainly happened in Russia during this past 4 years is that there are plenty of data we no longer have. Rosstat has ceased publishing series on foreign trade, on oil and gas production, on the structure of public expenses, on detailed data on banking sector and the likes. But sort of of the numbers that are still published, at least so far, no one has really detected any sort of great abnormalities that would point towards systematic manipulation of the figures.
But there is less and less material available.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. But still quite a lot.
I would like to ask you about the veterans, the returning veterans, because that is becoming bigger and bigger issue. And I know you've actually done some studies on that. We've seen already crime rate going up. Even in Russian, some of the Russian scientists have been studying that. This Willy Maslov, the famous study. It's partly because of the post. What is this, PTSD? But it's also because so many of them are former prisoners. What is your take on that, Margarita? How do you see this thing developing? Even though many of the former prisoners have died on the front, but still.
Well, we sort of did two types of research, sort of like looking at the casualties, wartime casualties. We took the BBC Media Zona data and merged them together with Rosstat, whatever, it's the best we have. It comes with several glitches, just to piggyback on the previous conversation. But returning to the veteran issue, so we have like two research pathways here. The first strand is about coffins returning to Russian regions. The second one is still living people who are returning. So when it comes to overall perceptions, so it seems like there is no cheering when it comes to like overall public opinion. On the other hand, it's also we don't really get so some parts of the Russian population are genuinely afraid of these people coming back. On the other hand, they're also like another part of the population that is kind of okay, and they think that these people deserve to be represented in the local authorities, like municipal councils, on the regional levels, and even higher up. So there is a bit of a fragmentation in the public opinion, and this is something that is showing up increasingly in the data that we have. So similar results, I guess, also Jussi came across in his own studies. On the other hand, so there is some kind of a reluctance to even speak openly about these people because, well, again, the whole overall environment, everyday life, even for those people who are extremely far away from politics and probably whose households are not touched by the war, anyhow, they still realize that certain things probably not super safe to say out loud. So it also the same applies to public opinion polls. That's why my overall advice not to rely on them at all, unless you desperately need to look at the behavioral data and consumptions data. So read The Economist here. So I'm not public opinion specialist. So I'm shooting myself into a leg now, but that's the most brutally honest response. So yes, so the overall perception is split and the crime rates actually increased.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely agree. I think, of course, in a general picture, this is an unprecedented, that this is the biggest veteran problem Russia is facing since World War II. And the major difference is that when maybe the World War II was still a kind of a defensive war, it was a war of the existence of the Soviet Union against the Nazi invasion, and that's why it's so sacred. And there is all kinds of repetition plans to merge the Great Patriotic War with all kinds of wars, and especially with the current one. But here the main problem is that there is still a lot of this mercenary model. There are volunteers, and this is also maybe reflected on the perception. We do have a data, for example, regarding that how Russians would perceive if their relatives or friends are signing the contract. And there was I think in February 23, there was a majority, not high majority, but something around 55% were viewing this as positively, and now it has extremely dropped. So that gives an indication that they are not so happy about the idea of, and definitely when it comes to that, are you ready to go to the war by yourself? As I mentioned, it's definitely out of the question.
Yeah.
But here, I think this veteran, what we see is the lot of potential for deeper frustration or major frustration in both sides. That there are all kinds of benefits, or enormous amount of all kinds of legislation, building a different kind of benefits for the veterans, social benefits, benefits in the labor market, benefits in the higher education, not only for veterans, but there's children and wives and cousins and I don't know how many, all kinds of it expanding all the time. However, I think the major motivation to doing that is simply to make the actual recruitment more appealing. Because now what we see is enormous amount, also the reports, still a little bit on an anecdotal level, but there are plenty of, for example, those critical telegram channels who are reporting that those compensations and help which is guaranteed for them, returning veterans, are neglected with all kinds of bureaucratic excuses. And there is also an economic indication that while the regions are struggling with the recruits and trying to high up the salaries and remunerations, they are preferring the actual contracts. But when it comes to the compensation, it's not that important anymore. So it's a very brutal model, and a lot of maybe the kind of rewards for the death and their relatives is easier, but especially the reports going some sort of an reintegration plans, it's coming worse. So yeah, this is and of course this very idea of when Putin is talking about the building the new elite, the actual, well, they are doing that symbolically and trying to build all kinds of positions which could indicate that in reality they are actually trying to do that, not to put them into the positions with a real power. And maybe to add that it's quite interesting that there was a plan, especially kind of pleasing Putin's visions, that the future Duma will have 100 war veterans from 450 Duma representatives. The latest news were that maybe 80 or less. We are not so happy about the idea.
It's going to be less.
Yeah. But so they try actually downplaying that, because the simple fact is that war doesn't sell. So it's very important difficult to make a campaign in this situation with a war thematic. People don't want to hear that, not so much.
And they are returning to a tanking economy. People from the front, Laura, right?
Right, or at least, I mean, if, those people returning to the front, from the front, they no longer receive the high salaries once they get the compensation, whatever it then appears to be. That's the end of it.
Yeah.
And that may be quite of an adjustment story, even for those who are sort of come back healthy and in full strength, on sort of readjusting to an economy that's not, first of all, growing very far and probably not enjoying a good salary at all. That's going to be a different country that they may return to than they believed when leaving. That's absolutely true, and it's as you mentioned, it's something unprecedented.
Yeah. You've been saying a few times that the war doesn't sell now for the Russian public. Did it sell better before? Or have you seen any trends how the support is going?
Well, I think it's tied with
the support might be a word.
Approval maybe is the right
maybe,
word.
Yeah.
The kind of a general passive acceptance. But I think I would say that if there is a major victory, the kind of repetition of the Crimean scenario, there would be a higher support.
Yeah.
We do not see the kind of revenge mentality which we typically see among the so-called Tsetniki or these militarist activists who are talking about the revenge and we are so much given blood that we cannot stop. This is fortunately a minority view. What we typically see in the major population is that every time there is the real reason for some sort of a celebration, then there is popping up. This is a kind of rally around the flag effect.
Yeah.
But now there are good grounds not to support it anymore. And what I'm not a military expert, but the situation for Russia in the front, of course, they are pushing a little bit forward and there's a little bit progress, but certainly it's not such an progress that they are waiting for and looking for. So and there are huge casualties. So this is the problem.
But how do Russians see the war? Is it a war against Ukraine or war against, how do you say it, like the United West? Or
there is a special term that actually has very long pedigree in Russian propaganda. Under Putin, it's collective West.
Collective West, right, yeah.
So, well, according to the surveys and studies that we conducted and also our colleagues, so basically when we asked who is to blame for whatever is happening now, who is to blame for launching the war back in the February 22, so who started first? So, and what do they think? So yes, it's the West to blame.
Yeah.
But also we asked about, but would you say it's difficult to tell? You know, everything is very ambiguous. In Russian it sounds, it's a very infamously known, you know, everything is very controversial. There's no way we can know the whole truth.
Yeah.
Right? We also witnessed sort of the increase on this scale. So people consciously refuse to answer this question. So I think every single party is one way or another is guilty, is involved. So yes, it's actually the overall mainstream opinion is that it's the war against the West. So, but when Trump became, you know, it's a very interesting bromance between Putin and Trump, right? So I don't want to elaborate. It's not really my area of expertise. But if we look at the Russian propaganda, and Jussi is also a big expert here, it's very, you know, like fluid. Sometimes Trump is the best friend, and sometimes Trump is the worst enemy. So, and it might change overnight.
Yeah.
So it's in this sense, if the logic of fight against the West, who is the West? And ultimately, it seems like it's the European Union. It's us. So Russia is at war with us.
Yeah, and actually I could add that it should start as a special military operation against Ukraine. But then when it failed, and it was not a 3-day, 1-week program, it became a war against the collective West. So it's to try to downplay the role of Ukraine, and this is very well visible in some propaganda efforts.
Because of course Russia would have taken Ukraine.
And then the plan was to take the Ukraine, and then we can go back to business with the West as usual. This was maybe the Putin's expectation.
Seems to be so.
Yeah. Ukraine is kind of seen as not fully capable of even being an agent in the geopolitical scene. This is why Ukraine is sometimes very often in public opinion data is actually even doesn't show up as, you know, as a real actor.
Yeah.
It sounds horrible, but yes.
But that is something that is shared by the Kremlin and the population at large, right?
Exactly, it's this kind of interplay. So the audience, kind of the public says, okay, what's the safest way of seeing things, especially the ones that they have no, impact on. Okay, that's the Kremlin's opinion, then they reiterate it.
But it also has historical roots for the...
Obviously, yes, it's a more complicated mixture, of course, but yes, it's kind of a mutual game all the time. It's mutual reading of signals from both sides.
Yeah. No, I think it's both Russia or the Kremlin certainly miscalculated and misunderstood both Ukraine and the European Union.
Sure.
When making the decision, I think it's become crystal clear, and that's probably part of the reason why the aim of this whole operation has been changing, because you cannot wage a successful war if you realize that you will not get it. Then you need to redefine things and going forward. And I think, at least up until now, also the European Union has continued to surprise Russia for being probably more united than anyone thought in the beginning.
Yeah, and a little bit again this kind of situative switching of or changing manipulative control, or whether operation against Ukraine or against the West. It's quite revealing that all those now quite unprecedented ideological projects, what we have seen in Russian school education, like this compulsory subjects for the special military, the discussions of the important things, and there's a university subject on what is the foundations of the Russian statehood, and then this unitary history textbook. All those initiatives, actually, the planning started in the summer 22. And I think it's not a coincidence. It started in summer 22. We realized that this is going to be a long war. So there was actually, my guess is that if had Ukraine fallen in the spring, there would be no such a need for such a project, because then they've sensed a certain figure sense in the presidential administration and the rest that there's a need for such a kind of an ideological calibration against the collective West, and of course there's also a rule for the corruption, because huge sums of money are circling around all these projects.
Absolutely, and it's absolutely summer 22 when we see the public expenditure starting to hike, especially also the production of the military sectors of the manufacturing branches of the Russian industry. That's when the increase started to take place, not before.
And that spending is good for corruption as well.
Absolutely, a sector which is state-dominated, non-transparent or secret by nature, is a fertile ground for both corruption and all other forms of sort of misuse of public authority, for sure. And that's the sector of the economy that's been growing in Russia for the past 3.5 years. And that's also one of those structural changes within the Russian economy that's taking place. Those sectors are increasing in share and power.
The honeypot, in a sense,
Just to anchor this conversation, and also today, like yesterday's news, so one of the recent Oscar winners, the documentary movie by one of the Russian teachers. Actually, he's not even a teacher. Just to sort of to give you a vivid example from the ground. So he's actually a videographer.
Yeah.
Anyone familiar with a school education in any country, are you familiar with such a profession as a videographer? So the person was tasked, his job description was to shoot the videos and send it to report that the school teachers do not cheat on the tasks sent by the ministries. And this is a very new, how much money the budget and the ministry, because municipal education is still, it's public sector. So how much money is spent on hiring these extra people to be paid to shoot every single class like this. So this is absolutely, it's incredible amount of people, number of people, right? It's money. They're paid. So, and if we look at that documentary not as spectators, right, viewers, but from the economic point of view, this is again, Kremlin doesn't trust its own teachers.
He was complaining that he had to spend so much time uploading these videos from the classrooms to some kind of a governmental system.
Yes, so there are thousands of people like that with a similar task. They do not teach.
But that's good for unemployment figures, right?
Well, certainly, but Russia was sort of the unemployment was practically taken non-existent already before the full-scale invasion.
Yeah.
So there should not be a need to create fictionary jobs, and quite the contrary. The labor shortage has been one of the the hard constraints of the economic growth for the past couple of years.
You said earlier that the support for war is highest in Moscow, which traditionally we've seen Moscow as the most critical towards the Kremlin and Putin's rule. Is it because they're just able to keep their eyes shut, and the war doesn't really affect them that much, or what's the reason for that?
Well, I think this is an indication that in that respect, this Putin's kind of traditional social contract works. It works, that keep off the nerve centers out of, because I think this whole thing is about the constant balancing between the normalcy and militarization. And Russia is heading towards the situation where this balance is very seriously distorted. Because what we see, and it's not only related to the militarization, but in general about the putting more and more censorship and more kind of an intrusion into the people's private lives. And this is actually counterproductive. We do know that in previous cases, that in cases when Russians protests, it is always related to the situation where their kind of private sphere is distorted. For example, in the municipalities, in ecological projects, some other, and this is distorted. But here, I think
that was also, it was safe to protest.
It's safe, yeah. But it's also it shows that people are not so interested what's happening in Ukraine or war or something, but they are much more interested. And I think this is a universal pattern, that it's much more what's happening in your backyard. If there are major economic or, for example, ecological problems. But I think in here we see that, the Moscovites have been kept out of the war. There's still quite a normal life keep going, although it's also distorted because all kinds of drone attacks coming then. But definitely the situation is different, let us say, from Belgorod or some other, like the frontline the cities or the poorer regions. So here I think it works, and actually it shows this kind of a structural hypocrisy in this Russian perception that there is a general approval of all these patriotic cliches, like the commemoration dates and the military parades, that trust in the army, whatever. This is the very kind of this abstract approval. But when it comes to the concrete questions, that are you ready to give part of your salary to the army? Are you ready to go by yourself, or how you relate, as I mentioned, about if your relatives are willing to go? No. But this is not the problem for majority of Moscovites. They can still follow the kind of the conformist pattern and to be happy. Maybe also, I don't know, maybe Margarita could add here, but maybe one explanation is that there is also huge amount of these bureaucratic elites living in Moscow who are maybe benefiting for the war. But I think this is an interesting pattern, because typically the Moscow has been most critical towards Putin's policies.
Are there changes in the relationship, among the regions? I remember already in the early 20s when I was traveling, even if you went to Irkutsk, Khabarovsk, Arkhangelsk, everywhere they said that Moscow is treating us as a colony, and it's even more like that now. They are shipping boys to the front from there. So is there some kind of unease growing in the regions that we don't see?
Well, in general, so I will rely on two empirical studies that are not published yet, but they will be. So the first one, is actually to what extent people are willing to donate to all sorts of initiatives to help those in the front lines. It's just I'm kind of returning to the previous conversation. And anti-Moscow sentiment. So these two things actually exist when it comes to donating and helping the front line. So if it's the employer who asks the person to donate, the likelihood of donation willingness actually it's already low, the baseline is low, it decreases. If it's a priest or someone from the Orthodox Church, it decreases even lower. So it's the least respected endorser. So the employer is so far the most efficient because, it's the one who pays the money. People pay mortgages from their salary, so here we understand the logic. And finally, people are more likely to donate to non-military medication, for example. This is something people are more likely to donate. When it comes to weapons, drones especially, again, overall willingness to donate against the baseline willingness to donate, which is, again, is already very low, is also kind of it drops down. Very interesting. So when it comes to, so the second question was about the anti-Moscow sentiment. It became very prominent even before the full-scale invasion, with the Shias protests in Arkhangelsk, in Komi Republic, against landfills, and basically...
That was the demonstration when the Muscovites decided that they take their trash with trains to 100 kilometers away to Arkhangelsk region. That was the protest area.
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, like, there are several, plenty of evidence showing that people living in those areas, they spelled out loud, so we're not Moscow's colony, we're not keeping trash coming from Moscow.
Yeah.
So Pomorye не помойка, like Pomorye is the title of the region, it's not it's not a trash can for Moscow. So,
Yeah.
and the same kind of sentiment was observed in Bashkortostan, fighting to protect Kushtau. So again, environmental affairs used to be perceived as safe havens for civil society activities before the COVID pandemic. But after February 2022, so these areas are also perceived as highly securitized and politicized.
So can we say that the support for war it's also that's what Putin's regime has been trying? Apathy is the thing that they've been aiming at for over 20 years, and they're also seeing that in the support of war, that people keep their distance for anything.
Well, yeah, I think it's of course it's a problem in a situation where as I mentioned, that there is a need for mobilization. There would be a need more for it, but at the same time, the very idea of this Putinism, if we want to call it, is that people are atomized. People are get rid of the politics, and this is also I would say, very important part of the regime consolidation in
Even
Russia.
Even key part, you could say.
Yeah, but sure, because it allows this kind of the models of corporate voting and this idea of where people are. It's the kind of this general sense of exiting politics, where I'm not interested. Politics is not my thing. And I think it would be too preliminary to argue that this whole system is about in deep crisis. I think the still which kind of carries is that the kind of an approval for the system, approval of the Putin is definitely decreasing, but it still maintains and maybe help with kind of repressive measures, that there are no alternatives. That it is completely kind of a as Margarita mentioned, that there are hardly no sphere anymore where would not be securitized or seen as a political risk. Even in a regional administration, we do know that this lower levels of the governance has been kind of pretty effectively eliminated. Yeah. Although it used to have no power at all, but it's still now seen as a theoretically potentially risky. So I think this is a kind of an indication of the level of paranoia for the regime. And this is the idea that if you would allow some sort of or any more form of autonomy, or very little autonomy of them, this is kind of distorts the very idea of that maybe they are not loyal, and this kind of this overall pattern of this sort of Putin stable is breaking. So I think. Yeah, it's very difficult to find a solution, and as I mentioned,
repressions.
It's a repressions, but how to make an effort, because we are kind of regularly discussing and debating in the media and in different stages that now there will be a mobilization, and now it starts to go to the mobilization. Well, I wouldn't exclude it completely, but it would be a threshold still is a huge for that. Because, and as those remarks, what we see in, for example, in preparations for the Duma elections, I think this actually tell the story that they do care about what the citizens think, and if there is this sort of a growing war fatigue, it has to be somehow cope with the Putin's expectations, and it's a difficult task. So I don't expect that if there's a mobilization, it certainly will not happen before the Duma elections.
Yeah. Oh yes.
Well, I guess that's if I are not on the regions, Russia is a funny sort of a federation in a sense that regions have very little political power, but those also have very little fiscal power at all. So sort of all tax bases are determined by federal legislation, and most of all taxes are shaped and determined by the center, not by the regions. And now, especially things related to payments of all these mobilized persons, and sort of it seems increasingly difficult decisions are pushed to the regions and regional leadership to take care. And you fund this, you finance that, you organize this, you mobilize for the votes and the likes. But at the same time, the fiscal space is shrinking, and that's what we saw last year, first time for a very long time. Regions on aggregate were running sizable deficits, meaning regions were taking sizable bank loans, and that's going to be one further sort of stress and source of friction going forward. Someone has to pay those loans at the end of the day, and who's that going to be? Will be one further issue on battles between the center and the regions.
So we have to start wrapping up, but I think the question should we try and answer, where is Russia headed? And I think for the audience, if anyone who gives a clear answer, don't buy it. It's
well, maybe I could sound that maybe it's eventually our task, because it seems to be that the Russian Kremlin doesn't know where it's headed. It's becoming one of the features and problems in Russian politics that it's extremely short-sighted, and I'm a little bit suspicious in those kind of Western estimates. Well, depending maybe on the discipline, that there is some sort of a major long-term plan for Russia. I don't see any of that, and I think that, well, it's depending on how we define the strategy and tactics, but I would still rely on the point that the Kremlin doesn't have a strategy. There is a vision of some sort of a great power, but it's not a strategy. They do have all kinds of maneuvering capacities and good in tactics and kind of maintaining this sort of a resilience, but to seeing that this, for example, this recent developments, it's showing that it doesn't make sense, and it's still about this abstract priority for the war, and the same time even the short-term kind of potential for Russia's development is taken out. So it's becoming completely counterproductive in many respects. And for example, this what Laura mentions about this fiscal policy is that this general model that all the victories and potential successes are centralized or Putinized, and all the problems and challenges are decentralized. And we've very well seen it during the COVID pandemic, and the same policies are still putting out of the regions, while at the same time they don't have any autonomy. They have to do, for example, as Margarita mentioned about these donations, this is crazy. It's a kind of compulsory donations, the idea that someone is pushing and trying to show that, we are voluntarily doing this and that.
Yeah, that's also the yearly Putin's direct line. It's all about that, decentralization of responsibility. Margarita, where do you think it's heading?
Just happy to pick up from here, because, well, if we think that there is a grand plan, there is no plan. There was no plan back in the February 22. So this is why there is no need to actually learn how to read Putin's mind, because, again, so yes, he has a grand vision of who he wants to be, how he wants to be described in school textbooks. So yes, that exists, but there is no strategy in a sense, actually. What are the crossroads and what are the contingency plans? No, they don't really exist, because the whole system is deeply corrupt and is full of mutual distrust. So, well, my vision here, so where is Russia headed? Well, we are as the hostage of this situation and of having this neighbor. Again, so let me repeat this, should be open to any contingencies here. So that would be probably the most responsible approach. Starting from like coup, juntas, Putinism without Putin, and while of a sudden, if we like it, so maybe there is like, some kind of a lighter version of authoritarianism, although the likelihood is extremely low, but it's, again, let's be open to all the contingencies. Again, there is no plan. So any authoritarian regime dwells on three pillars. The first pillar is economic success. It's not here, right? So Russia has already lost economic battle here. So it's something that It's a question of time when it's going to be like a complete failure. Second one is brutal force, it's repression. And finally, it's lies, it's propaganda. Now Russian regime is somewhere like wiggling between the last two. And probably the third pillar of regime's resilience is running out. So now actually it's just simply, becoming a default, the most primitive political form of the regime. It's brutal personalist dictatorship.
Like in the naked form of the...
Yes, as you read in the books, and so this is, yes. It doesn't mean that this kind of chaotic regime is in deep crisis. Yes, it is, but it does not mean that it cannot inflict harm. So that's the paradox, that it can be both at the same time, and this is something for us to be aware of and to exploit its weaknesses.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would so much like to say something optimistic, but I don't say that in any baseline. Russia, at least for Russian economy, will be more state-controlled. It will be more isolated from the rest of us. It will be more inward-looking in all forms, both in R&D cooperation, in networks, in importing components and anything, and it's going to be more prone to corruption and other malpractices, just because of the change in the structures. It's going to be more militarized in long after hostilities end.
Well, thank you. And thank you all, Margarita and Jussi and Laura. Now we have time for questions. I don't see the audience really well with the lighting, but do we have mics that can be... yes, we have 2 mics. If you have questions, just raise your hand over here in the middle. We could take a couple of questions at a time.
So thank you a lot. My name is Katri Pynönen. I'm a professor of Russian security studies and great panel colleagues, very much of thinking. But I would like to, in a way, challenge you a bit on one point that I, in a way, agree, but then on the other hand, not like a typical academic thing. So you emphasize that there is no plan or strategy, but I think there is. There is the strategy of keeping regime as it is intact, not to get anything. And there is, in a way, everything goes around that. And the special military operation was about to get more resources to keep Russia going along its regime type of thing and not to get any challenges. So, and now this type of thinking we have that it just continues and maybe one day it collapses and that's it. I mean, 4 years of war, we should be doing better. So is there anything that you see on your expertise and with the knowledge you have, what could trigger something change in Russia in order that they would really need to start thinking outside of the box? Thank you.
Would you?
Well, brilliant question. That's the way. I think the kind of the paradox here, and on which actually I would strengthen my point of that there is no strategy, that this is very short-sighted, is the way of that how Putin is actually making his rule more stronger and stronger. And we actually see this growing centralization that if used to be that there is the idea of some sort of an autonomy for institutions and executioners of his power, that they had such a role of a little bit more independently to push forward this, for example, the Putin's plans. I would say that this is becoming more and more a sense that they are forced into to put it simple, the vertical, how it is built is becoming even more stronger. And one thing what is quite revealing, which was what I've been following and studying was, for example, during this Wagner mutiny, and I think it was quite indicative that it shows that although eventually Putin step into the side of the Ministry of Defense, in those reactions which were supporting and more supportive for the war, and Wagner demonstrated that there is no support for institutions in Russian society. There is only support for Putin in a sense of fear. I would say that for those militarists, Putin is not an authority, but they know the name of the game. Well, Prigozhin forgot that and paid the price, but many of them, they know that. But they can criticize Shoigu and Ministry of Defense. And I think this is a major indication that in the day when there is no more Putin, there is no kind of protection for these elite members, not only, but there is no protection for the institutes, in the political institutes. We are not knowing what's happening. I'm not trusting that, okay, now we are relying on the Duma or some ministries or whatever. Everything is around the centered in the Putin. So this is maybe sound banal, but unfortunately, as long as the development is going that every potential risk is eliminated in the system in order to guarantee the Putin's position becomes a kind of stronger. But in a further perspective, this is an extremely vulnerable system. We just imagine what would happen when the guy is gone.
But I mean, you can say that there's no institutions that have been hollowed out.
Yeah, they've been hollowed out.
Long time
and
ago.
And they were a little bit, maybe this was always poor, but they'll be hollowing out all the time.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Just to elaborate on that. So it's a brilliant question. Thank you for asking. So let's define a plan. So if we mean physical survival, well, that's the plan, okay. If we stick to that, so yes, I agree with you. So physiological survival, biological survival, if that's the goal, so, and I do believe, since we know how much he invests into his children's economic wealth, so, well, yes, he wants to live, like almost forever. But if we think of a plan as a policy strategy, how, for example, when, experts get together, bureaucrats, and they decide upon, like, political decision, how certain sectors of economy should develop, et cetera, so such things don't seem to exist anymore. And the rules of the games are also not known, because the higher is the degree of personalization and deterioration of anything like that even look vaguely remind informal rules of the game. They're increasingly not known. Imagine of like very old Windows system, Windows 95, where glitches accumulate constantly. So yes, that's the kind of system. So I think it's a kind of another metaphorical depiction of how Russian regime looks like these days. But again, it doesn't mean it's going to collapse tomorrow. So it can still cause a lot of trouble.
I think Windows is an apt example for us today. Yes.
Yeah. No offense to Windows.
Yeah. Do we have at the back? We have more questions. Just if you raise your hand. Yeah.
Thank you, Paavo Lipponen. I'd like the distinguished panelists think or comment. We need to think about the unthinkable. I'm being haunted by a déjà vu experience from 1999, when at the Helsinki European Union summit, the European Union, under my leadership, criticized heavily Russia on account of the Chechen war. But it didn't take too many months when there was a rush among the Western leaders to go to Moscow and start talking, and the Chechen war was practically forgotten. So, thinking about the unthinkable, could this happen again? When and if and when the war is over? We are already seeing signs that might should worry us. I mean, is it going to be the Americans making deals in Moscow, with Moscow? And what are the leading Western European countries like Germany and France going to do in a situation where there's a sort of there are spoils to divide with Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you. And this week we heard from the Prime Minister of Belgium, I suppose, who was demanding that there should be like a normalization of relations.
Well, definitely disagree from the Belgian viewpoint.
Yeah.
I think this is something which, comparing his previous types of that, we should not do well, going the frozen assets. And I think it's kind of indicated that there is still this sort of a fear of the Russian response. And you have to accept that fear in the situation if you want to build a more stronger posture for Europe. I definitely agree that Europeans should be more active when talk about starting negotiations, but the positions should be different, because I think Putin is definitely waiting about that now Europe becomes more reasonable and understands the power of Russia, and then there are all kinds of demands to that. So that's what I would say. Comparing the situation in '99, yeah, maybe there's déjà vu, but I think the situation is still cardinally different regarding the Russia-Western relations comparing today. So, yeah.
But you could also say it's what happened in '99 and maybe 2014 in a way made invasion of 22 more likely. That was a surprise for Putin that this time West react differently, right?
Obviously, yes. Yeah. And this is why maybe the way of pushing forward is that, first of all, we need to put more pressure towards Russia, but at the same time, of course, to think about that how to well, it's eventually up to us to do the work to convince, with pressuring the Kremlin, that for example, Europe needs to be more seriously, because unfortunately the attitude towards the EU in the Kremlin is not so positive.
And try to make sure that there is us.
Yeah.
Laura.
Yeah, thank you. On thinking on the unthinkable, if we can imagine a future where hostilities end and sanctions are lifted, for sure doesn't take long before portfolio investments flow in Russia. Mm. Trading goods is also likely to recover fairly fast, but then on any serious investments, I think we'll need to wait a long time. And one sort of a thing that is different now compared to many other episodes of thinking on the especially Europe-Russia relations, the light talks of European firms and companies returning to Russia are simply completely misplaced, because no Western firm will return to a market that existed before February 22. The Russian market is different. There's no country to return to. It's a completely new environment with new rules of game, and that's something that's going to limit private investments for a significant time. That's sort of at least that's how I see.
The risks are much higher.
Risks are much higher, absolutely, referring to the protection of property rights. The level of playing field is completely different. The players are different. The role of the state is different. And the competitors are completely different. Yeah. That's not a market one any company can return to. I think that's a completely misplaced thinking.
Thank you. And we had one time for one more question, and there was a hand up here in the middle.
Mikko Lappalainen, independent analyst. Sort of a supporting question. Where is Russia heading in international affairs vis-à-vis its friends? Does it have friends, and where is it going with the friends, with the BRICS and so on?
Well, at the moment, in economic terms, the major friend is China. what the war has changed the geography of Russia's foreign trade completely. Russia now relies one country only for more than half of its imports. China is more than half of Russia's imports, and that is a huge dependence. And China is also the major export market for Russia's export commodities. That's China certainly is a friend, but it's also a major potential vulnerability going forward.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, maybe to add in a bigger picture, that, or in a longer period, the picture looks pretty gloomy for Russia if you think about that. And of course, this was a major rupture regarding the Russia's allies, and also the Russia's capacity to sustain of some sort of an older ally relations. If we think about the Russia's relative power in not only in the post-Soviet space but also globally, especially in those areas where used to have a pretty strong Soviet presence. So in that sense, it's kind of a global reach, and posture is diminishing, and it's not it's a longer trend. And I think this last 4 years has actually accelerated this process.
Just to add on that, so when it comes to global South, obviously whatever happened in Venezuela and then Iran obviously showcased very vividly that Putin is in no position to protect his allies. But even if he happens to have very close economic and military cooperation with these countries. So when it comes to the sort of like authoritarian international cooperation, we see that there's such thing probably does not really exist. So it's more about dependency or mutual dependency and very contingent ad hoc relationships. And to add on the China, so I think it's not even friendship, it's growing dependence of Russia upon China. If you look at this, delegation that visit Beijing, so it's the highest rank, so like the whole lineup, the whole deck of the high-profile officials are there. It means actually they take it extremely seriously. And when it comes to like my own expertise, all the digital authoritarianism, all the gear actually is produced in China. Russia doesn't have capacity to even maintain its own sort of like semi-isolated internet and whatever controls it wants to have. So it fully depends on Chinese equipment. So I think it's not even friendship, it's something, more hierarchical, let's put it this way.
I think I heard Laura's air quotes as well, right? With a friend. Yep. China's a friend, yes.
Yeah.
Our time is up. Thank you so much. Now it's time for break here. There's some coffee, the hall for audience here, and the stream continues at 3:30. Thank you. Thank you, Laura, Margarita, and Jussi.
Thank you.
You all hear me? Excellent. So welcome back. I hope everyone had their share of 65th birthday cake and enjoyed some coffee and tea. We continue now with the second panel. And as in previous panel, we were discussing what happens in Russia. Now we take a look how Russia has affected us, and in the later part of this panel, we will be discussing about what to do with Russia. How can we coexist, and what kind of risks are related. Now, this session is divided in 2 parts, and the first part is going to be led by my colleague, and in here, we are going to discuss about a massive research that was conducted by Finnish Institute of International Affairs with the help of University of Helsinki and University of Tampere. And I would now like to welcome the leads of the report, Sinikukka Saari, who is presenting the lessons learned from the report on Russia's full spectrum influence activities in Finland in the 2000s. After this, we will open the floor for discussions, but Sinikukka. Please, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. Indeed, as Samu already mentioned, this year marks the 65th anniversary of the Institute. As it happens, 5 years ago, I actually had the privilege of standing at this very same podium during the Institute's 60th birthday party. On that occasion, I spoke about how we can make sense of the future and how both policy analysis and preparedness can benefit from foresight. Today, I would like to approach the same questions, but from the opposite angle. My remarks today will focus on how we can make sense of the past and how policy analysis and preparedness can benefit from hindsight. At first glance, of course, hindsight and foresight may appear to be opposites, but I will argue, however, that from an analytical point of view, these two are tightly interconnected. In many ways, they are like different sides of the same coin. At the end of January, FIIA, together with scholars from Tampere University and from the University of Helsinki, published a 300-page research report examining Russia's full-spectrum influence in Finland during the 2000s. This project represented the first attempt by the government to commission an independent, systematic, and publicly accessible scholarly assessment of Finland's post-Cold War relationship with Russia. The political context for this project is, of course, evident. Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, launched in February 22, fundamentally transformed Finland's relationship with Russia. A symbol of the magnitude of this transformation is the 1,340 kilometers border between Finland and Russia that has been closed since Russian instrumentalized migration campaign in 2023. In many respects, the Finnish-Russian relations today are at ground zero. For decades, the Finnish-Russian relations were characterized by dialogue and practical cooperation across multiple levels of society. Due to Russia's war of aggression and its ambitions in Europe that pose a direct challenge to Finland's national interests and sovereignty, the bilateral relationship has since narrowed dramatically. It is now defined primarily by deterrence and exclusion. Yet, at some point in future, the relations will inevitably evolve again. And when that moment arrives, it will be essential that we possess deeper and more strategic understanding of the key dynamics that have shaped the relationship in the past. This, in essence, was the purpose of our research project. Our research team conducted extensive interviews with more than 50 individuals who have played an important role in Finnish-Russian relations over the past 2 decades, in politics, business, public administration, diplomacy, and civil society. One of the key observations from the interviews was that key decisions were rarely the result of individual misjudgments, Rather, they were often shaped by shared assumptions embedded within the Finnish political elite. An illustrative example of this was former Foreign Minister Timo Soini's interview, in which he described how he had been highly critical of Russia as a young politician, but, as he put it, and now I quote, "The realism of foreign policy strikes when you become a decision maker. It does not limit your freedom of thought, but it does limit your freedom of speech. And gradually, it also affects the way you think." End of quote. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to highlight 4 key insights on Russian full-spectrum influence in Finland that emerge from our research. First of all, I would claim that the most effective influence operations are often those that remain largely unnoticed in the target state. Public discussion of full-spectrum or hybrid threats tend to focus on dramatic incidents like sabotage operations, cyber attacks, overt disinformation campaigns. But in real life, influence can also operate in far subtler ways. Indirect, covert, and seemingly positive interactions can gradually shape perceptions, incentives, and expectations within the target state. Indeed, as our research demonstrated, Russia's most effective influence operations in Finland have typically taken the form of indirect binding rather than overt coercion. Second, I would like to highlight the fact that Russian influence activities always operate within a local context. They draw upon the specific characteristic, institutions, and historical experiences of the target society. Finland is no exception. During the Cold War, Finland developed a strategic culture that emphasizes self-restraint, careful anticipation of Russia's reactions, dialogue, and pragmatic engagement with Moscow. Combined with credible defense capabilities outside of any military alliance, this approach helped to safeguard Finland's sovereignty during the Cold War years. After the Cold War, many of these habits and assumptions persisted. Yet the sense of vulnerability among Finnish actors diminished dramatically. This opened new opportunities for greater engagement and stronger interdependencies. The notion of special relationship between Finland and Russia also explains why it was customary to believe that despite the significant asymmetry between Finland and Russia, Finland could nevertheless still manage the relationship with increasingly aggressive Russia on its own, and even, to some extent, change Russia's strategic calculations. In the end, this proved out to be too optimistic an assumption. The third key insight from our research is that economic relations constituted one of the most important channels through which Russia's influence operated in Finland. While Russian geo-economic engagement reflected coordinated state strategies, decisions on the Finnish side were largely driven by private companies pursuing commercial opportunities. This mismatch created opportunities that Russia was able to exploit. Several interviews of course, emphasized that Finland was far from alone in this regard, and that similar assumptions were widely shared across Europe. Although, of course, true, it does not diminish the risks for Finland. Quite the contrary, I would say. It simply underscores how effective Russia's European-wide geo-economic strategy really was. And finally, and fourth, it needs to be underscored, of course, that Finland also has significant strengths and sources of resilience. In fact, our research showed that Finland's political culture, with its strong emphasis on consensus and pragmatic problem solving, has played a dual role. On the one hand, it makes it more difficult to challenge prevailing assumptions and to identify structural vulnerabilities. But on the other hand, it also promotes unity on core national security issues and reduces internal divisions that external actors might seek to exploit. Indeed, our findings suggest that Russia's coercive hybrid operations and disinformation campaigns have often had just the opposite effect from what was intended. Rather than dividing Finnish society, they have frequently strengthened national unity. Traditionally strong trust in public institutions and the media, and a long-standing culture of comprehensive security and societal resilience have all proved to be important sources of strength. Yet these features cannot be taken for granted in future, but they also need to be carefully nurtured in changing conditions. Friends, understanding how events unfolded in the past enables us to identify the patterns, assumptions, and blind spots that shape how we interpret the present and anticipate the future. By examining how we interpreted signals relating to Russia in the past, we also strengthen our ability to respond to tomorrow's Russia challenge. We need greater strategic clarity. If in the past Finland sought to manage its relations with Russia primarily through bilateral engagement, today we are more willing to recognize that Finland's national security is inseparable from wider European security. Strong and safe Finland needs strong and safe Europe. Today's theme is Russia and Europe, managing antagonism and risks. I would highlight that managing antagonism and risk is not only a question of how we understand Russia, it is also how well we understand ourselves, our strengths, our values, our vulnerabilities, and our capacity to act together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sinikukka, and if you could please join me.
Yes.
And I will give the floor soon to the audience, but I will also give you a few minutes to think on your questions, that what you would want to pose to Sinikukka. I will just start that this research is one of the most cleverly written high-level pieces of analysis that I've seen in years. I don't even know that have the broader audience understood the value of this piece, of the research done. It is a strong foundation also to build on in the future. And my question would be, before everyone is given a chance to grill Sinikukka on this project, is that you were talking about to Finland to be strong, we need Europe strong. Have you seen the similar level of research and analysis done in other European countries when it comes to Russian influence in these last 26 years?
All right. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Well, I think, of course, countries are very different. In much bigger states, I think overall the debate is more active, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a commissioned research from the government. And there are, of course, like very interesting reports that we did read, like, for example, from Germany, and also like contemporary books that discuss the German-Russian relationship and also the dynamics that played out there. We did read it with great interest, and I think there are some other reports that have, for example, mapped Russian networks of influence in Germany. Then I know also that in the UK there has been similar projects, and I think there is kind of a petition actually to commission also a kind of parliamentary investigation into the Russian-British relations, and that will be very interesting, of course. I do think that it should be a European-wide endeavor, so that we really see, what are the lessons that we should learn. And what really scares me the most is really that we start building business relations with Russia without having a critical look how Russia operated in the past. And when it comes to the interviews, for example, many of the interviewees definitely were critical, and they, in hindsight at least, did understand like that some of the decisions were based on kind of flawed logic, and that Finland took very big risks, for example, in the economic sphere, and it wasn't really understood at the moment. But then there were many interviewees that kind of, their attitude was that, okay, it went pretty bad, but it could have went better, so there is not really any need for further analysis in a way, and I think that is dangerous approach.
Thank you, Sinikukka. And for the time being, this report is only in Finnish, but the aim is that we will get at least highlights and the essence translated in English for the audience also. Now, the first question / comment that I'll give is towards a major friend of FIIA, former Prime Minister of Finland, Mr. Paavo Lipponen, who has served as Finnish Prime Minister for 4 years and has had also a major role in building the FIIA as we see it today. 8 years. Beg my pardon. So, Mr. Lipponen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I should say spasiba, Dr. Saari. And the first word I learned, Russian word, was spasiba. and the first sentence on the night train, aboard the night train to Moscow in the beginning of 70s was "Дайте мне, пожалуйста, стакан чаю." I had some experience during the Cold War times, like negotiating on a communique with the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party. So I've been facing these situations quite a few times. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment this major study. I haven't had enough time to prepare myself for this. I would have said something in any case, but it is a huge challenge to, first of all, study as it really is a massive study and document. It's just difficult to read. So I'll limit myself to a few points. And the first is, what is the purpose of this study? There's nobody here representing the government who could tell that why did they commission this massive study, 300,000. What are how are they going to use it? Those who paid for this. That's the first question. You need not answer this because you can't. And then about the method. The interview method. How were the people chosen who were interviewed? I was not interviewed, but two presidents were interviewed. But I was in charge at a time when the most important, after adopting the new foreign policy by the government of Aho, the most important decisions were made that gave Finland the resilience for up today to resist Soviet Russian influence. The year 2000, it's hard to understand why that was chosen by the government as the year after which you made a study on that period, because really one of the turning points in our relations with Russia was membership of the European Union. That meant that our relations were not anymore bilateral, at least not only bilateral, but we were part of the European common foreign and security policy. And we were active to develop that policy, even in a leading role. I'm just naming the summit 1999. Naturally, there was a bilateral relationship, but how can you interpret it as a sort of that we were not aware of what was going on. And the whole thesis presented by Dr. Saari, that we would have been naive, unaware of some unseen Russian influence. I just can't discern this, in that we were struggling all the time with Russia. And particularly the argument that we took, that Finland took big economic risks. There were some companies, and these cases are noted in this study, but they were not of the magnitude that they would really be relevant, because we became less independent on Russia economically, particularly in energy, because we made those decisions already during my time. I was in charge, and not the presidents were in charge.
Thank you.
I would have a whole host of comments, and I'm ready to take on you, the researchers who made this.
Thank you, Mr. Lipponen. Thank you for the remarks. In the essence of sparing time, Sinikukka, if you want to comment, feel free to do so, and then we will have time for one additional question from the audience before we need to continue until the second part of our panel. But Sinikukka, please.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Lipponen. So yes, you are absolutely right that the focus of this research were 2000s, and it wasn't really up to us, but it was really the research task that the Prime Minister's office formulated, and I do not know the background why it didn't cover the 1990s. Of course, we did cover some of that, but as a background, and the interviews that we conducted were focusing on 2000s, not 1990s. So that would be the very quick explanation. And then also I would like to highlight that this research were made by a research team of 15 researchers, not only by me. And we had the best experts there is in Finland covering the specific thematic chapters. And for example, the geoeconomic influence chapter was the main responsibility of Veli-Pekka Tynkkynen from the University of Helsinki. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I presume we had one question on the third floor. Sir, if you want to introduce yourself when we have the chance to deliver mic for you.
Thank you. My name is Paukkunen from the European Commission representation here in Finland. I would like to ask you a more forward-looking question. I try to keep it short. I would be interested in hearing your views on the forthcoming EU's security strategy. What should be included, just like stemming from the argument, which is absolutely correct, that Finland's security is interconnected even more with the whole European. So what should be included for managing the Russian risks in the future?
Shouldn't you be commissioning that study for us? Sinikukka, if you care to take
that is a very challenging question. Let me just put it this way, that for very long time, I think the European security strategy was really to avoid the topic of security. And that was really a problematic approach, and I think it very much led to a situation where we are today. Because if you have security challenges, you cannot avoid the theme in order not to provoke an aggressive actor. And I think this, for a way too long a time, was really the security strategy of Europe. Now I think, and for example, it was so evident when looking at the neighborhood that I have specifically studied sort of the Eastern Europe and what used to be called the Eastern Partnership countries. There, for example, you develop the integration and the relationship with these states, but you try to somehow exclude hard security-related issues from the relationship. And that did not work very well, for example, in countries like Moldova or Ukraine, or Georgia for that matter. So I think this is really the time of reckoning for Europe in that sense. I only wish that some of this strategic thinking would have generated already a decade ago, and not only now when we are in this kind of very dire situation.
Thank you very much, Sinikukka, and please join me in applauding the work done and your presentation. Thank you very much. And now the second part of the final panel. This is about discussing how Europe should cope with Russia. We have an esteemed panel, and please join me in welcoming Kristi Raik, the director of ICDS. Mr. Thomas Gomart, director of Ifri. And of course, our very own Arkady Moshes, who is the program director at FIIA, and also the most senior person at FIIA who has been working with the Institute for the longest of time. So the purpose of this panel is to discuss what to do and how Europe can cope with Russia of today. We posed the question how to make sure that living next to such a neighbor in Europe will feel safe, if it's possible at all. Then we are planning to explain some of the European discussion by our panelists. The idea is that each and every one of the panelists will start with short remarks of their own. And then we will engage with the whole house. I do want to hear questions. This is a rare opportunity for us to have this high level of a panel in Helsinki. But please, Kristi, would you be able to start the journey?
Thank you, Samu, and thank you so much, FIIA, for the invitation. As a former FIIAn, I'm always very glad to be here, and congratulations to FIIA, and congratulations to Sinikukka and the team for this really important report. So the way you define the topic of this event already gives us a starting point, suggesting that we should expect antagonism and we should expect risks. And what we discuss here is how to manage these. And indeed, we can also find these definitions from the core documents of both the EU and NATO, saying that Russia is a long-term threat to European security. And most likely, I would say, this threat will increase once the fighting in Ukraine stops, because we are likely to get to a situation where Russia is not satisfied with what they have achieved as a result of the war in Ukraine. We are likely to have a ceasefire, but not necessarily an actual peace agreement. And we are likely to have a Russia that is revanchist and still has a view of European security architecture that is incompatible with how European countries would want to define our security architecture, its core principles. And in that situation, of course, it will be hard to establish some degree of stability and think about restoring dialogue. The concepts of stability and dialogue are not in any way like magic words or solutions that will just by themselves bring any solutions. I do expect at some point dialogue will be restored at the highest political level. I think the purpose mainly should be to manage risks and to reduce the likelihood of unexpected escalation. But you cannot undo the fundamental strategic disagreements by just talking to each other. And we shouldn't expect that Russia would redefine its goals regarding Ukraine or regarding the Russian understanding of Russia's privileged influence in the neighboring countries just because Europe becomes more willing to restore cooperation. Let's also think for a moment about what the Russian side thinks about stability. I don't think Russia necessarily will want to achieve stability if and probably when the war in Ukraine ends with this kind of ceasefire and an outcome that does not satisfy the Russian goals. I would think Russia prefers actually to have a situation of instability where Russia continues to try to influence Europe and especially its neighboring countries in various ways that actually keep instability. And for Russia to want stability, I think it would have to be stability on Russia's terms. If we think about the Cold War era, there was a stability of sorts for several decades when Russia was controlling half of Europe. And I guess Moscow would not mind going back to that sort of division of power or balance of power. And at the same time, the Russians tend to be quite successful in making Western counterparts believe that Russia does want to have stability, Russia does want to have peace, only if Western powers take into consideration Russia's legitimate security interests. That's the phrase that has often been used in the past. Well, I'm afraid what Russia calls its legitimate security interests with regard to Ukraine and some other neighboring countries are not legitimate from the viewpoint of Ukraine or European countries more broadly. So when we look at for example, the American discussion, we can see that the US has defined this goal to restore stability in the US-Russian relations. This is the language used by the current administration, but also the previous administration of Biden was very keen to talk about strategic stability. And for me, coming from a small neighboring country of Russia, this always kind of brings this sense of alert that what if this stability will be established at the cost of the security of Russia's neighbors, as it has happened in the past. I'm afraid the discussion also in the American expert circles often is still rooted in the Cold War frameworks and understandings of the US and Russia as major powers who kind of negotiate amongst themselves about security in Europe, which of course then from the European point of view raises a whole lot of questions about our own agency and right to define the terms of security architecture in Europe. And I will finish with my opening remarks with this idea of restoring dialogue, which has been discussed recently in Europe. I think we should not see dialogue in black and white terms as good or bad in itself. But what is lacking in the European discussion is an understanding of what can realistically be achieved by restoring dialogue at this point. And what is it that Europe aims at by restoring dialogue? Before we go into the questions of who should be the person talking and when is the right moment, we should have understanding of our goals. And also we should have understanding of the reality that Russia at the moment is not seriously interested in dialogue, at least not if it is dialogue in order to achieve peace in Ukraine on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine. We are not in the situation where Russia would feel enough pressure so that it would be seriously ready to engage in peace negotiations. And in order for that to happen, to get into a situation where Russia wants to have a serious discussion about peace, there has to be more pressure put on Russia. And unfortunately, what we see happening now during the past couple of weeks, one of the effects of the war of the US and Israel against Iran is that the pressure on Russia is actually diminishing and not increasing. So I'm not at all optimistic at when we will reach this moment where we can actually sit down with the Russians in a negotiating table. Once we get to a point where there are new realities on the ground that kind of impose this will on Russia to negotiate in earnest, then of course Europeans need to be involved in one way or another. Maybe I stop here for a moment.
Thank you very much. Before going to Thomas, I just had one question, a quick question. Based on your analysis, it seems that the initiative of opening up connections seemed to be much more popular in Europe compared to Russia. And during the end days of Cold War, it were the Russians, and it was specifically Gorbachev during 86, 87 who started a series of speeches. And one angle there was to open up channels of communication. Is there any that kind of discussion in Russia? Is there a pressure in Russia to engage in dialogue, or is it a futile hope from our end?
Well, what we see from the Russian side is willingness to have dialogue with the US. And this is not in order to achieve peace, unless it is peace that means capitulation of Ukraine. But I think one important purpose of this dialogue is for Russia to be able to position itself as an equal to the United States. And for some reason, President Trump has allowed this to put in, to position Russia as on a par with the US. And again, it brings to one's mind the Cold War situation when the two superpowers were meeting and negotiating. Just think of the images of the summit in Alaska, in Anchorage, last August. And yet, Russia today is obviously a lot weaker than the Soviet Union was. So I wonder why the US is willing to create this image of Russia as an equal. So this is the dialogue, this is what the dialogue is about for the Russian side, and also the Russians are hoping that the US might be willing to put more and more pressure on Ukraine, because we have seen this happening to some extent, that the US expects Ukraine to be the one that makes concessions. But on the European side, the Russians don't see this kind of readiness to agree to a peace on terms that would be acceptable to Russia at this point. So why would Russia want to involve Europeans in the negotiations? They don't want to do it.
Thank you very much. Then next, Thomas. France is of course a major player, and we would be more than delighted to hear thinking that you have there with regard to Russia. Would you be able to shed a light on that?
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for your kind invitation. Very happy to celebrate this anniversary and to be back here in Helsinki. Last time it was 12 years ago. I participated in a workshop organized by Arkady. So it was just after the annexation of Crimea. So it's very good, and congratulations for all the very deep research you are doing. Maybe two initial remarks to start to respond to your question. The very first one is in continuation with the first session, is to say that Russia is at war, given the level of attrition, which is absolutely unbelievable in a sense. And I think that part of our difficulties in Europe is just to understand the figures of losses, of course, for Ukraine and for Russia, and to make a simple comparison between the Russian military inefficiency by comparison with the Israeli military efficiency elsewhere. Just have a look, about the differences in terms of losses to catch the picture, to say nothing about the political consequences of the conflict. But I start with that. Second, there were, in my opinion, last year, two strategic surprises. The very first one was the degree of Ukrainian resistance, because after the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, it was said that Ukraine will be defeated, and I think it is still the objective in the Kremlin. But indeed, without the complete US support, Ukraine continued to fight, and that's remarkable and should be noticed. The second strategic surprise, it is the degree right now of ideological collusion between the White House with President Trump and the Kremlin. And it was unexpected at this degree, because the narrative has turned. Kristi rightly referred to Anchorage summits. The idea that to some extent Ukraine was responsible for this war was said a couple of times by the US president. And all his attempts to negotiate, yes, indeed, pressure the Ukrainian side. So I start with that because the problem we face is the fact that Russia is at war, whereas European countries are not, and also are unable to produce a deterrent effect, whereas they are spending more and more for their military. That's our paradox in Europe. We are approaching 300 billion of military spending a year, and we are still unable to deter, in fact, Russia. And that leads to a very fair point made by the MAGA movement, not only the MAGA movement, also other people, in the US strategic community. How do you explain that rich Europeans continue to rely on the US to protect themselves against aging and declining power, which is Russia, which is also, by the way, a nuclear power? And it explains a lot. I will be back on that. 1 year ago, I was invited, at the CHODS meeting in Paris. So the CHODS were the chief of staff of 34 countries, not only NATO, because there were also Australia, Japan, and others. And I was asked to start by Admiral Radakin and General Burka to start a net assessment of the relation between Europe and Russia up to 2030. And we had a steering committee. Kristi very kindly participated in it, and Iski also was part of it. And we made this report, which was written between last June and last October, just to try to analyze the forces, the force on the European side and on the Russian side. The idea was, given the transformation of the transatlantic relations, which is not something wanted, in Europe, but we should, of course, take into consideration this real move. What about, this balance of power? So the conclusion of this report is quite simple. It is to say that European countries can face a long-standing confrontation with Russia if, and it's a very big if they have the political will to do so. And I think that what was done by the Finnish Institute with the report you have presented is very interesting, because in fact it is really a question at the end of the day of political will in all European capitals. And for obvious reasons, geography, history, political influence, and so on, transatlantic relations, this will is different depending on each European capital. So let me continue to give you the main insight of this report. On the economy, the report is divided into 4 main parts. The first one is on the economic front, the second one on the military one, the third one on societal balance, and the last one on international positioning. So very quickly, on the economic front, we assessed that Russia economic momentum culminated by the end of 2024. But there is a recent game changer, which is a situation, I will be back in that in my conclusion, the situation in the Hormuz Straits, which will, if it's continue, and I do think it will continue, which will put the European in a very uncomfortable position. Having said that, the long-term economic outlook for Russia is very bleak for the next 2 decades. And there is a parallel made in the report between the situation of the Russian economy with the Iranian economy. And once again, it was written last autumn. Europe has absorbed the shock of the energy decoupling. It was very costly. It was very expensive, but the shock was done, and to some extent accelerates, thanks or because of, I don't know, this war accelerates its energy transition. And Europe is positioned to become the world's most electrified economy by 2030. Thanks to that, to some extent, in terms of investment orientation. There is another issue which is less research in the report, but which is highly important, which is the one related to the financial assets and what should be done with the Russian financial assets managed by Euroclear. But I let that for the Q&A. Second, defense and security. The confrontation rests on a profound asymmetry in perception of threats and strategic intentions. Europe is weak in the land domain by comparison with Russia, which has the advantage in terms of mass firepower, mobilization capacity, and tolerance for attrition. For air, sea, cyber, and space domain, Europe can have the advantage with a huge issue, which is its level of stocks, especially ammunition. And it's also related, I think, to what's happened right now in the Middle East or can continue to happen. There is, of course, a nuclear factor. Russia used its nuclear rhetoric, and that raised new question about, of course, the US extended deterrence through NATO, and also the UK and France deterrent postures. Third, political system and societal resilience. It was very rightly said during the first panel, Russia consolidated its authoritarian system. No need to elaborate on that, and we should be prepared to a chaotic transition after Putin. In any case, it will be a chaotic transition. And of course, Europe is continued to be much more attractive in political terms, even if we observe rise of populism in many countries. Fourth, alliances and international positioning. What is interesting from a Russian point of view, we do consider that Russia is deadlocked militarily in Ukraine, but to some extent, Russia is partly successful in diplomatic terms regarding the so-called global south. For the so-called global south, personally, I prefer to speak about the transactional south, but for the transactional south, this war in Ukraine is very peripheral. It's a regional issue for Europeans. And the paradox in which we are, it is the fact that for us it is so important. The more we invest in that, to some extent, the more we are getting peripheral at the global level. NATO, EU, no need to say the importance of the last NATO enlargement to Sweden and Finland. I go very quickly. The EU remains the largest global public aid donor. That's impressive. Almost, 100 billion a year, and no strategic communication on that regarding the global south. That's fascinating, We are all the time criticized by the transactional south, whereas European countries are the main donors. So let me conclude with maybe two points to open the discussion, to continue our joint thinking. First of all, yes, I think it's clear that Europe, broadly speaking, including Russia, lost its main competitive advantage at the global level, which was its strategic stability. And it is lost for two main reasons. First of all, a new balance of power with a less US involvement, and to some extent the most preeminent military power in Europe right now is Ukraine. It is the Ukrainian forces, which, by the way, are supposed, for instance, to train the German forces. We should understand also the consequences also for the military industry, the change, provoked by the Ukrainian distance, and the nuclear dimension. So, as you may know, there was an important statement made by President Macron 2nd of March, when he said about, I don't know to translate it in proper terms in English. In French, it's dissuasion avancée, so advanced deterrence or forward deterrence, which is not a completely changed, not at all in the French nuclear doctrine, but it is an adaptation, an inflection related to what happened in Ukraine. And the last point is maybe also an attempt to have a retrospective perspective. I think we are facing a new energy shock, whatever will happen, in Hormuz in the coming weeks. It will be very expensive for ASEAN economies, for European economies. we are in a situation in which the US strategy is not very clear. The Iranian strategy is very clear. It's to transform or to transform a guerrilla approach to the strategic level. So Iran, whatever the future is, will continue to fight in different ways, and of course it will impact European economy strongly. So we are an energy shock, and that reminds me, the situation at the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s. At that time, we had also an energy shock, and we had also a very strong strategic conflict or very strong strategic tensions with the Euro missiles crisis. And I think it's interesting to have this period of time, between the invasion of Afghanistan, the revolution in Iran, the energy shock, and our time. Why? Because you had, in fact, at that time, a division between Europeans and Americans on energy. We were within the Euro missiles crisis, but European countries, namely Germany, Italy, France, but also the UK, decided to get, some Soviet gas, and to say that by trading, to some extent, it is a way to try to improve the relation or to create the good framework of cooperation. Not cooperation, the word it was too strong at that time, but to start by trading to improve the overall relations. And that leads also to very different choices made between European countries related to the first shock. The first shock, the decision of a country like mine was clearly to go for civil nuclear energy, whereas Germany decided to go for much more Soviet gas. And it is still there to some extent. So I stop there by just asking a question, or maybe to make an assumption. The more the crisis in the Hormuz Strait will long, the more the debate on energy, on Russian energy, will resurface.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this fascinating remark. So you're practically saying that fuel your cars and prepare for the discussion to emerge with regard to Russian gas.
I think that, the European market is lost for Russian gas. If the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, if the blockade of Strait of Hormuz, is partly lifted for Chinese, Indian, Saudi Arabia, Russian ships, but blocked for American, UK, French and European ships, yes, we will have a deep trouble. Yeah. Because the ability, to diversify our supplies, Qatar is no more in position to export, its LNG. So the only source will be to some extent the US. Partly Norway, but it depends on the proportion. So it is not we are not in a similar situation at the beginning of the 80s, not at all. As I said, part of the report insists on that, for the energy mix and the energy transition, the reinvestment, on nuclear civil energy has been made, and it is working much more properly right now than in 2022, especially in my country. We overproduce, electricity right now, so it's not the same situation. But it depends once again on the duration. Imagine in February 2022 that we would be today to speak about the continuation of the war in Ukraine. So just imagine this situation in the Hormuz Straits. I don't hope so, but my job is to try to be, lucid. Imagine, just until this summer, and the macroeconomic effect will be massive.
Before we go to Arkady, do you see any hope for Europe?
Yes, of course. We have many assets. That's what also it's something we insisted on in the report. I think that Europe should stop to to criticize, just try to improve the situation, certainly to work more. We have in Europe, partly in my country, a real issue of productivity. We are an aging population, but at the same time we have very significant assets. So yes, there is room for Europe, there is clearly a space for Europe, no doubt about that. And the more, the situation is completely unpredictable with the US, the more Russia in this situation, the more we are pressured by China, we will be obliged to react by ourselves. I'm pretty sure of that.
Excellent. We will come back to this. But next, Arkady and the FIIA voice. I'm waiting to hear again.
I'll try to make sure I will not have lost it by the end of this presentation. Thank you, Samu. Very good afternoon to everybody. I will start with a vignette, an illustration. Don't take it verbally, but it might be interesting as an illustration of what we're going to be talking about when we're talking about Russia. Do you know which memorial days or day are celebrated today in that part of the world? There are 3. One was celebrated in the country in which I was born, the Soviet Union. It was the day of the Paris Commune. Very important date. I mean, it was not a holiday, but it was a date by which a factory could be opened, which would have been planned to be opened by the 1st of May. So that would be like... The second date, it's today, in today's Russia. It's the day of the reunification of Crimea with Russia. People forgot, but the referendum was on the 16th, but actually on the 18th, Crimea became a subject of Russian Federation, and that's why this is the holiday. And the third one is, it belongs to the country which I'm doing a lot of research on, which is Belarus. Do you know what that is? The day of the interior forces of Belarus. So why I'm wasting your time? Because look at that. You start with the utopia. You go down to imperialism, and then you go further down when you understand that you need a repressive apparatus to deal with your own country. Yes, as I said, it's not totally logical. It's 3 different countries. But nevertheless, there's something in that that I wanted to share. Now I'm going to the topic of this presentation, implications for Europe. First of all, Samu, I would maybe say something hopeful and encouraging, which is not what I'm famous for, but I'd say...
I can vouch for that.
I'd say, again, for somebody like myself who spent decades on bashing Europe for its inaction and slowness and laziness and all that, I'm even surprised with myself, but I'm saying that now something has changed in the right direction. Europe started showing teeth. It's showing teeth to the Russians. It's showing teeth to the Americans. It's not necessarily a very good thing, but it's now a necessary thing. That's a preface. Concerning the main body of this presentation, I have 2 small points, one bigger, and then a remark on the dialogue. If we are talking about any implications for Europe, and if we are talking about what we should do, my first recommendation would still be to try to explore whether it is still possible to somehow restore the Western unity. Maybe it's not, but I'm not like totally desperate. I don't want to completely archive the history and the story of the Western unity. Maybe something can still be done. Not under Trump, but maybe under some future president. It's not going to be easy anyway. If it's possible, it has to be tried. If it's not possible, if Europe says enough is enough, and on the other side of the Atlantic, the politicians say enough is enough, yeah, that's fair enough, it might happen. But then Europe has to become a power itself. It has to relearn the art of being a power, of applying power. Again, I had an article about half a year ago where I dealt with 3 examples. Russian-Chinese relations, Russian-Turkish relations, and Russian-Azerbaijani relations. I don't need to tell you about the United States. I don't even need to tell you much about Turkey. But who could imagine 15, 20 years back that Azerbaijan would have such a policy, not just independent of Russia, but a policy of challenging Russia, and again, challenging Russia not just in the Caucasus, but much, much more globally, that Azerbaijan would become a country. Yes, its plane was downed inadvertently, but how many times you, ladies and gentlemen, heard Putin apologizing in his 25 years in power? How many times? Not so many. He apologized before the Azeri president. Just think of that. You should, that's my point, that Europe should learn or relearn to understand how power works, what segments of power work vis-a-vis Russia, and it should become a master of using it. For me, that's one of the important takeaways of what's been going on in that part of the world recently. My second point, honestly, a couple of years ago, I did not think I would have to come back to it. I was writing about it before, earlier, in the beginning of the war. But then I thought we passed that. Now I see we have to do it again. Just today I was reading articles. They're appearing again and again in Europe, in the European debate. Basically, the articles that recommend to surrender in Ukraine, just to give Ukraine to the Russians. That's very unfortunate, but that's a reality. If these people have not yet heard the arguments of the other side, of our side, they probably would not be willing to hear them again. But at least one point they may be able and still have to understand. It's too late to buy comfort for themselves just by dropping Ukraine, by giving Ukraine to. It's too late. I'm afraid I have to say that's what was tried in Minsk 2. Less so in Minsk 1, but in Minsk 2, definitely. There was an attempt to somehow say, by the very fact of naming Putin, not a participant, but a side which wanted to, I don't know, mediate along with the Germans and the French. There was exactly that point, that, Mr. Putin, we don't think you're doing something wrong. It's they're doing something wrong. And of course, Putin knew how to exploit that situation. What I'm trying to say is that at that point, it could still be, I mean, people dealing with international relations are usually cynical people. I mean, they say that if you are not, you can go work for the church. But if you're in this business, you have to be doing things the way you can. The point was that at that moment, it could be understood that the big European countries wanted to keep the good relations with Russia at the expense of Ukraine. Now it's too late. These relationships are in ruins. Look at the Finnish-Russian border. That's the best illustration, the best symbol of where we are now that can be found. This border saw 13 million crossings in years like 12, 13, 14. 13 million crossings. It stays closed. That's where we are, not just Finland. Most countries do not have such an epitome, such an illustration, but I mean, they're still in the same basket. So we need to continue explaining that surrendering Ukraine and surrendering in Ukraine is not an option, because it's not going to buy you anything anymore. My third point, I see I'm running out of time, so I'll try to be quick with that one, although I was going to make it a little bit longer. These points would maybe fit more if we already had a post-Putin Russia. But we're not going to have post-Putin Russia anytime soon, and I had a good prepared manuscript, so I'm going to use it. So, first of all, we should be consistent. The policy towards Russia should be consistent. It has never been. We've always liked these little things like, I don't know, values and interests, or dialogue and sanctions. No, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because one of these components would always dominate over the other one. And it would be interests in the first case and not values. And it would be dialogue as opposed to sanctions. It took Europe enormous amount of time before it understood it actually had to and could sanction Russia. But if we go back in not so distant future, post-Crimea future already, Nord Stream was despite all the rhetoric, Nord Stream 2 was being constructed. Minsk 2, which I mentioned, everybody pretended that would bring peace to Ukraine. And I become paranoid when I remember that event, Helsinki, I think it was 19, right? When the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe restored Russian delegations' rights, full rights. Russia was deprived of all those rights immediately after the annexation of Crimea. There was a list of prerequisites put on paper, which Russia would have to do before its delegation would receive its rights back. Well, Russia behaved the way it behaved. It stopped paying money to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And surprise, surprise, of course, not because of that, just after that, but all the rights of the Russian delegation were restored. That was capitulation. That was capitulation. What I'm saying that there's no space for any inconsistency like that. Both and. No, you're not going to get both and. It's not going to work. Another thing which could be still tried would be a policy aimed at achieving at least a modicum, at least a little bit of internal domestic liberalization. If you cannot achieve it now, which is probably the reality, you can still put it on your banners, saying this is what we want. The talk that we can have transactional relationship with Russia, it's a no-go. You have to have this value component, liberalization, democratization, you name it, component in your policy. That component was buried in 2006. Again, I was arguing for decades that had been wrong. But we cannot correct history. Unlike some of our friends who rewrite textbooks and believe that this is how they're correcting history. Anyway, this is difficult but doable. We should, again, as before, but also now, try to prevent systemic corruption or policy or approach based on corruption, which we guise as economic interests. It's not a new thing, but it's now becoming understood better and better all the time. How much the Western decision makers were basically systemically corrupt by means of getting very well salaries in Russian companies after they would serve. So I don't need to go too much into that. But again, we're not past that point. The fact that Putin's representative Kirill Dmitriev goes to the United States and discusses economic projects, one of his recent proposals of a project to the Americans was actually 4 times the GDP of Russia. I don't know I don't know how they calculated such a thing. I don't know how the Americans could take it seriously, but they did, seemingly, because somebody came and told them that this is what you have there to gain if you come to the Arctic with your drilling. So I don't know what is he proposing. So we're still seeing in the Western behavior this economically driven, money-driven approach. This is wrong. First you achieve peace. First you stop the war. First you stop a conflict of such a depth, and then you talk about the economics. If it's the other way around, I don't think we're going to get much. I had some other smaller points, which I'll drop them now. But I'll say a couple of words about the dialogue. Well, first of all, of course, as a Russian, I have to be dreaming every once in a while about becoming a global dictator, otherwise it just doesn't work. So if I were a global dictator, my second decree would be, I'll tell you in couloirs what would be my first one, but the second one would be that I would ban the word dialogue. Dialogue is a completely misleading concept, because at the end of the dialogue, or every round of dialogue, or I don't know what, you are not supposed to take a decision. You can continue dialogue endlessly, as opposed to the negotiations. Well, you can continue negotiations also for a long, but when nothing is there to negotiate anymore, when it just doesn't work, then you drop, you walk away. But dialogue you can continue endlessly because you don't have to take a decision. That's why I don't like it. And I particularly don't like when we are now talking about the dialogue between, or independent dialogue of Europe with Russia. Well, first of all, because we had it. Didn't we have exactly that between 14 and 22? There was a dialogue. There was a very nice Normandy format and some other formats. They just didn't work. And again, we can explain why, but I mean, we need to re-examine, and reanalyze this recent history to understand that it's not particularly likely to work. But the worst thing why I don't like the very concept of dialogue is that if Europe approaches Russia now with this, as it is doing, it will come in a position of a supplicant again. It's going to be a strategy du faible fort, of a weaker side towards the stronger side, which is not the case, or at least not simply the case. It only makes sense to have a conversation with Russia if you have something you can drop on the table and maybe bang on the table. If not, if you just come in to say, maybe we can talk, no. I wanted to stop here, but I'll tell you one historical anecdote. It's not 100% correct, that I rechecked, but almost there. When in 1918, the German delegation came to the headquarters of Marshal Joffre, and they were asked, why are you coming here? The answer was, we came to discuss peace with you. And then, allegedly, the general told them, we're not going to discuss anything with you. You can go and come back, and they come back. It's not true, but that's how history books are written. They came back in 15 minutes and said, we came to ask for peace. And then, of course, the conditions were dictated by the winners. But this is where semantics need to be remembered. If you're going to Moscow to discuss things, at the moment in particular, they're not going to talk to you. Because their understanding of Europe as a weak party is dominant, it's absolute. There has to be something else than just coming, talking, listening to the other position and continuing the dialogue. Stop here.
Thank you very much, Arkady, for this energetic and I would say even youthful presentation. And I will steal at least 3 or 4 lines from your presentation. Maybe one question before we go to question for all, and then I do want the audience to participate. You were talking about the fact that Europe needs to relearn how to be a power. Where does that European power derive from? Where does it reside at the moment?
Nowhere. It has to be condensed. It has to be brought back. I would start with a simple thing. I think that the most useful thing which the EU could do now would be to discipline its own members. That when the decision is taken, it's actually taken for everybody. We should go against this enormous amount of special statuses, special cases, exceptions, and so on and so forth, because that's what ends up in this power being dispersed. And that's a Herculean task, but that's not impossible.
Thank you, Arkady. In all 3 cases, in each and every one of your speeches, you were at least referring to the fact that whilst there is an interest towards more dialogue, the only proper thing for us to do would be to engage in dialogue only from the position of strength. Is this something that you would want to elaborate? Which is then the path for the strength in the European discussion? Easy question, I know, but this will give some time for the audience also to participate. How will Europe build that kind of position?
Shall I
Please
start? Well, what has been missing from Europe's power for a long time is the hard power element, right? Europe has been quite strong economically. It has this common trade policy, unfortunately not always using it enough to kind of promote its interests, but that element is relatively strong. But now what Europe has to do is rearmament, and it is doing it, to create credible deterrence vis-à-vis Russia, which today Europe is not able to provide on its own without a significant US contribution. So Arkady was referring to this idea of whether the unified West can still be preserved. I don't see now Europe willing to break the ties because the dependency is just too strong. It is diminishing. And Ukraine is buying time for Europe to build up its own capability. But it's the US side that is questioning whether this alliance with Europe is still useful, whether it is still needed. And of course, the Trump administration has its own peculiar approach to NATO and allies in general. But looking kind of beyond Trump, there is this strategic goal of the US in future to contribute much less to European security and defense. And I think this is not something that will go away. So the process of rearmament that we are seeing, and where at least the northern part of Europe is now really performing very strongly. Germany is performing very strongly. This has to be continued. And I'm sure the Kremlin is watching this process very closely. When you look at what kind of hybrid pressure Russia is putting now on Europe, we still often hear that the Baltic states are the main targets and the most vulnerable ones. Now, I would say now there is much more pressure on Germany and the other like major big countries in Europe, because it's the rearmament of Germany that is most critical for Europe's future defense and deterrence vis-à-vis Russia. And this is something that Russia wants to block. But we know what are the specific capabilities that Europe has to build up. I mean, well, some of these were referred to already. This question of manpower, stocks of ammunition. We have weakness with intelligence. We can see it very clearly in Ukraine. That's one thing that the Ukrainians still need from the US. We have shortage of air defense capability, long-range strike capability, and yes, indeed, manpower is something where Europe has to become more convincing power. When Moscow looks at Europe, I think they see this potential, certainly, for Europe to be able to stand for itself.
Thomas.
First of all, I must confess that the first time in my professional life that I listened to Arkady without blaming Europe. Yes, we are really in a new area. So I'm very happy just to be back to Helsinki for listening to that. And more seriously, you know, at the end of the Second World War, there were three main decision makers: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And question is, who can represent Europe in this context right now? It's not an easy question, because remember that, you know, after the Anchorage summits last August, I think that eight European leaders with President Zelensky came to the White House. So it's telling to some extent. If we thought in terms of Europe as a power, I think that, you know, maybe we should be more careful about that, because is it really the job for Europe to play the same game than Russia, than the US, than China, even than Turkey? Frankly speaking, I think it's not an easy answer, because our organization, our construction is not. It's a French expert who say that. Maybe we should be more careful in that. Second, unless we are ready to pay the costs financially and also to accept human losses one day or the other, which is not the case at the time being. And you're right, to some extent we benefit from the time which is produced, the strategic time which is produced by Ukraine and its resistance. So for me, maybe a way to try to respond to your question is to try maybe to zoom out from Ukraine, because we are very focused on Ukraine for obvious reasons, and the decision is really in the Ukrainian authorities' decision. But apparently they do want a ceasefire, and apparently also there is no wish on the Russian side to achieve that. They are pressured by the US, but the ultimate decision to continue or to stop is the Ukrainian decision. For Europeans, I think that we should zoom out and maybe to try to think about, how with an antagonist Russia for at least, I don't know, many decades, or to try to find out new rules of the game. So it is maybe in this way that, I don't know, I know there are many, thinking on that in different think tanks and so on, about security architecture. We are now in a situation of collapse of European security architecture, and simultaneously the collapse of security architecture in the Middle East. So there is certainly a moment in which there will be, a need to find a way. It's not only to say, the winner should arrive and order its rules. I think it's something much more complex. And maybe we should zoom out, because one of the key transformation of our situation it is that Russia is thinking in Eurasian terms, and before its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we had this declaration of unlimited friendship between China and Russia, which is a big move. The fact that North Korean troops fight in Ukraine is also a big move. So my point is just to say that, okay, there is Ukraine. That's for Europeans, no doubt about that, the center of gravity for defense and security, but that's not the only issue. And a way maybe to think in terms, I don't know if dialogue is it is maybe too positive in the current circumstances, but discussion are needed, because in one way or others, we will be obliged to restructure an architecture in Europe and in the Middle East.
Excellent. Arkady?
Well, I actually don't have much to add. I agree with everything that the colleagues said. I just wanted to say that this, from the philosophical point of view, I didn't say it's going to be an easy task, but I think it still needs to be done. But from the philosophical point of view, today's Russia's interests and worldview is quite different from European. Europe is interested in peace, stability, and trade, or economic relationship at large. Russia is not afraid of a war. And that's a big thing. I mean, it might change. We heard from the colleagues that it's changing, probably is changing, but so far it's still there. And so it's not afraid of continuing the warfare in Ukraine or maybe larger. And furthermore, it uses them as its major resource also in diplomatic terms. I even do not understand how you can structure your relationship with such a country unless you develop a component like the army, like a much stronger defense component of your own, which you can use in the same way. Or other than that, we will all have to just wait for things to happen in Russia, which may, but we don't know how long it's going to take.
And be willing to use that component. Right. Now, questions. I already see one here. We have Mr. Pertti Salolainen in the front row, if you would like to start, sir. And then After Mr. Salolainen, Sinikukka.
Thank you. We are in a very strange situation. Both Putin and Trump wants to weaken European Union and Europe. One example, they are both playing the game with Orban in Hungary and supporting Orban in Hungary, who is the bad boy in European Union. I mean, it's very easy to find things that show that both United States or Trump and Putin want to weaken European Union. Now, the latest is that President Trump said that United States doesn't need NATO. He said that yesterday. They don't need NATO. We need NATO, and we want to continue with NATO in Finland. But the problem is that European Union is quite strong. It's one of the strongest, unions, economic unions, customs unions in Europe, and in the world actually. And it is not, European Union is not weak. We have strengths, but how to get to use these strengths that we need now? How to get more unity and how to get more leadership in the European Union? We remember those times when European Union was led by Paris-Bonn cooperation, and then later Paris and Berlin. But now the problem is that European Union doesn't have real good political leadership. It's a problem. The Commission can't be a political leader, but we would need more political leadership in the European Union. The old problem is still there. Where should Kissinger call if he wants to know what European Union thinks? Kissinger is no more there, but the problem is there. Who is leading and telling what European Union wants? Is it Mr. Merz in Berlin? Is it somebody else in another capital? We don't have political leadership. That's the biggest problem that we have.
Sinikukka.
Thank you. Perhaps this is a continuation from Pertti Salolainen's comment. So my follow-up question would be that I think that you all pointed out that something needs to be done with regard to EU decision-making. And we should be able to, we shouldn't change completely what we are and how we do things. I think in the long run, they are definitely assets. But on the other hand, we have to be able to move quicker. And Pertti Salolainen just highlighted the importance of political leadership. But the other thing is that how should we move forward? I think is the way forward that we have coalitions of the willing inside the EU and with external partners? Or is the way forward that we have to change the decision-making rules in Europe? And here, of course, it would be very good if you would have very concrete ideas. Thank you.
Any concrete ideas? Maybe starting with Arkady.
Very concrete idea. I would make sure that there will be an expulsion clause. Because if somebody misbehaves, if somebody doesn't want to take the rules of the club seriously, there's no business to keep such a gentleman or a lady in that club. That's one, but this is the one which I love. But then there would be the others as well. This is what I said 30 minutes ago. One of the important functions of the European Union should be should be in bringing discipline into its own ranks. On the leadership, just one remark. I agree that there has to be leadership, and I don't know where to get it. But I also immediately jump back to the epoch when there was a leader in the European Union. She was just leading it in the wrong direction.
Thomas, care to continue from that?
I take the word also of discipline. Maybe in the other way also, I think that's, it's important that everyone respects its attribution. And we observe an evolution of the presidency of the Commission, which is, I think, an issue by comparison with the Council, for one thing. So I think it's important to respect the rule also in this regard. But more importantly, yes, for political leadership, that's a key issue. I will be fully in support of that. And my answer to you, Mr., is your word of coalition of the willing, not only for defense and security. By the way, it's not only security, it's more and more defense. And certainly there is some topics on which, some European countries do want to accelerate integration. The Eurozone is a cool example of that, And I think we have no time right now, given the pressure coming from Russia, coming from the US, coming from China, also coming from the South in different ways. We have no time for a new re-engineering, a new, institutional re-engineering. Problem we have politically, it is the fact that the EU constitution, it's explained, in my opinion, a lot of the populism rise during the last 2 decades. The fact is, we accepted or we implemented a constitution which was initially rejected by referendum by 2 countries. And the adaptation of that with the Lisbon process was done, okay? After the enlargement, it was done. But the political cost of that is today, because as soon as you have said to people you should vote and you take the other direction of a votation, for sure you can't expect a full support. So the problem is also that now in more and more European countries, the European project itself is not really popular. And the difficulties, badly, but that's the political situation, are explained by the EU. That's precisely, the point in my country. So on that also, I think we should find ways to reconnect, the opinion with the European project.
Excellent, Kristi.
Well, thank you. These are, of course, really critical questions for Europe, leadership and how we take decisions. I have spent a lot of my career studying EU foreign and security policy, including the institutional aspects of it. But I have to say one of the big conclusions I came to is that the core problem with European foreign policy is not institutions, but it is politics. So we can continue refining the institutional machinery and the decision-making rules, but as long as we have the political diversity that we do have in Europe, we need to work on that side in order to have a stronger Europe. And now we are in this moment of disorder. Like the old structures are eroding and collapsing, and it's somehow unavoidable that in this situation you have a stronger role of coalitions of the willing. You need to get things done fast, whether it's defining future security guarantees for Ukraine, strengthening specific defense capabilities in Europe. Then you work with like-minded countries. And from a small country perspective, of course, it's always risky because when you go into this direction of having various coalitions working on different initiatives, it may happen that one day smaller countries are just left out from something that will be having a huge impact on their security. So it's not an ideal solution, but I think I fully agree with Toma that this is not the time to work on this kind of institution building and redefining. But there is one really also urgent issue for Europe's future security structure, and that is how we integrate Ukraine. And this is something where I think Europe has to be very creative, because I'm not too optimistic about the fast-track full membership of Ukraine in the European Union. I'm sorry to say this, but again, looking at the political diversity of views on this and the fact that enlargement is not a very popular policy in many member states, we have to find some other ways to integrate Ukraine, because this is what Europe will need for its own security and defense. And for the time being, Ukraine's NATO membership is also frozen, and no prospect of when it can be or if it can be defrozen at some point.
Thank you, Kristi. I only saw the hand of our two-time former Prime Minister, Mr. Paavo Lipponen, and we have only a couple of minutes of time. So if I could please ask to be concise in the question, so we will still have a short window of opportunity for our panelists to respond.
Thank you. For future meetings, there should be more time for discussion in the audience. But thank you for really brilliant remarks by the panelists, and you really laid out all the misery we are in Europe. What I had in mind was really touched by Sinikukka Saari. That is the question of how to, as I would put it, how to make Europe strong. And Dr. Raik analyzed this extremely well, where we stand now. That is, we can't have another enlargement without deepening integration in the European Union. We might end up with this scenario that only coalitions of the willing will function. That's the most likely result. But really, membership of Ukraine is really relevant. And I also think that it's just not possible to have a sort of to make Ukraine a member of the European Union without having some stages in it. So, but I think that to make Europe strong, eventually it must be done. There must be a structure, and that is why we need to change the rules, and particularly, as Sinikukka Saari was pointing out, to make that we could make majority decisions in common and common foreign and security policy. We have missed so many chances to make Europe strong. It was my policy. It was a Finnish policy. I mean, now I'm talking about the report that was made today, that we have been discussing today. So many chances were missed, and the responsibility really lies mainly in France and Germany. I had the experience that they fought each other behind closed doors, and at the time when we were 15, then we should have done it. But we understood, of course, that already in that time that every enlargement makes it necessary to deepen integration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lipponen. And actually, we are already a bit over time. I just wanted to thank the panelists, but also the audience here and from their homes that have been participating and watching the 65th FIIA Day that we have been celebrating here today. But please join me in giving a big hand for the panelists and for the audience. We will, of course, continue with some music, and I presume there's also drinks upstairs, and please join me and follow the leads to hear the presentations. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much for being active. And thank you for joining us in our celebrations.